Step into the world of medieval cuisine, dear listener, where food was often a test of endurance rather than a source of joy. As you settle in for this historical journey, feel free to share in the comments where you're tuning in from and what drew you to this tale of gritty bread and watery ale. If you find solace in exploring the past to unwind, consider subscribing for more calming historical narratives. Picture, if you will, a rustic table set with a humble meal, a bowl of thin, bland porridge, a hunk of dense, coarse bread, and perhaps a few morsels of tough, stringy meat if the diner is lucky. This was the fare that sustained most people in medieval times. While kings and nobles feasted on lavish, multi-course banquets, the average peasant subsisted on a diet as meager as it was monotonous. What factors conspired to make food in the Middle Ages so unappetizing for the masses? Let us explore this question and transport ourselves back to a time when filling one's belly was a daily struggle. In a medieval peasant's home, the aroma of exotic spices was noticeably absent. Cinnamon, ginger, nutmeg, pepper, these were luxuries reserved for the wealthy, brought from distant lands by intrepid merchants. Imagine the life of a spice trader in those times, navigating the treacherous Silk Road to bring a taste of opulence to European shores. For a glimpse of the value placed on these rare flavors, consider that in the 11th century, a pound of nutmeg cost 7 fattened oxen. The prohibitive expense of spices meant that the common folk had to make do with the pungent notes of garlic, mustard, and vinegar to enliven their plain fare. The blandness of peasant cuisine was not helped by the scarcity of fresh produce. Without reliable means of preservation, fruits and vegetables were seasonal treats at best. The lucky few who had access to a plot of land might grow some hardy crops like onions, leeks, and cabbages, but these were hardly enough to balance out a diet heavily reliant on grains. Breads and porridges made from barley, rye, and wheat formed the backbone of most meals, sometimes supplemented with legumes like peas and beans. While this diet was filling, it lacked essential nutrients, leading to widespread malnutrition and stunted growth. Meat, though prized, was a rarity on the peasant table. A prosperous family might keep a pig, some chickens, or even a cow, but these animals were valuable resources, not to be slaughtered lightly. Meat was reserved for special occasions like weddings and religious feasts, or when an animal was too old or infirm to serve any other purpose. When meat was available, every scrap was used, from nose to tail. Offal or organ meats were common peasant fare, as were small birds and game caught by trapping or hunting, though poaching in the royal forests was a risky endeavor punishable by severe penalties. Fish was more accessible than meat for those who lived near rivers or the sea, but it too was often preserved by drying, smoking, or salting to last through lean times. The result was a far cry from the delicate, flaky fillets we enjoy today. Herring, cod, and eel were among the most common catches, and they would be packed in barrels with generous amounts of salt to stave off spoilage. Freshwater fish like carp and pike were a delicacy reserved for the nobility, who maintained private fish ponds on their estates. The scarcity of fresh food meant that medieval cooks had to get creative with preservation methods. Pickling, fermentation, and drying were all common techniques to extend the shelf life of perishables. Cabbage would be shredded and fermented into sauerkraut, cucumbers and onions pickled in vinegar, and fruits like apples and pears dried for winter storage. These preserved foods added some much-needed variety to the peasant diet, but they were a far cry from the vibrant flavors of fresh produce. Even staples like bread and ale, which formed the foundation of medieval sustenance, were not always trustworthy. Unscrupulous bakers might stretch their dough with fillers like ground acorns, chalk, or even sawdust, leading to loaves that were as hard as rocks and about as nutritious. Ale, too, was often watered down to increase profits, a practice that earned some alewives a nasty reputation. In a time when clean drinking water was scarce, weak ale was often the only safe choice, as the brewing process helped to kill off harmful bacteria. This brings us to perhaps the most unappetizing aspect of medieval dining, the utter lack of hygiene. Without an understanding of germs and food safety, contamination was rampant. Livestock were often kept close to living quarters for warmth and protection, their waste seeping into the same areas where food was prepared and consumed. In crowded cities, garbage and human excrement filled the streets, tainting water sources and attracting vermin. It's no wonder that foodborne illnesses were rampant, with even royalty not immune to the perils of spoiled fare. King John of England, for example, is said to have died after overindulging in peaches and new cider, a feast that likely led to a fatal case of dysentery. The specter of disease was never far from the medieval dinner table. The Black Death, which wiped out a third of Europe's population in the 14th century, spread in part due to the unsanitary conditions that allowed rats and fleas to thrive. Food markets were particularly notorious as breeding grounds for pestilence, with flies buzzing around meat stalls and rodents scurrying underfoot. It's a wonder that anyone survived the perils of medieval dining at all. Yet, even in the face of scarcity and disease, there were glimmers of gastronomic hope. Monasteries and abbeys often served as havens of relative plenty, with well-tended gardens and orchards providing a bounty of fresh produce. Monks were known for their culinary skills, with some even penning cookbooks that offered a glimpse into the more refined cuisine of the upper echelons. Of course, this food was not shared freely with the masses, but some monasteries did offer alms to the poor as a form of charity. For the nobility, feasts were an opportunity to showcase their wealth and power. A royal banquet might feature dozens of dishes, from roast swan and peacock to delicate pasties and sweetmeats. Spices flowed freely, as did wine and ale, creating an atmosphere of gluttonous revelry. But even these lavish spreads were not without their dangers. Food poisoning was a common occurrence, with spoiled meats and rancid sauces taking their toll on noble stomachs, and the sheer volume of food consumed could lead to painful digestive issues, a reminder that even the privileged were not immune to the hazards of medieval dining. As we reflect on the harsh realities of food in the Middle Ages, it's hard not to feel a sense of gratitude for the abundance and variety that we enjoy today. Our supermarkets brim with fresh produce from around the globe, our meats are safe and sanitized, and our spice racks hold flavors that would have been the envy of any medieval monarch. Yet, even as we savor the fruits of modernity, we can't help but marvel at the resilience and ingenuity of our ancestors, who made do with so little and found ways to survive in the face of unrelenting hardship. So, the next time you sit down to a meal, take a moment to appreciate the bounty before you. Savor the flavors and textures that medieval peasants could only dream of, and raise a glass to the countless generations who toiled and struggled to bring us to this point. And if you find yourself grumbling about a less-than-perfect dish, spare a thought for the medieval diner, for whom even a simple bowl of porridge was a hard-won blessing. As we let our minds drift back to that distant past, let us take comfort in the knowledge that we are the fortunate inheritors of centuries of culinary progress. And let us not forget the lessons that history has to teach us, lessons of perseverance, creativity, and the enduring power of the human spirit to find sustenance and joy, even in the darkest of times. And so, dear listener, I bid you good night and sweet dreams of a world where food is not just a necessity but a source of endless delight. May your own culinary journey be filled with flavor, nourishment, and the warm glow of gratitude for all that we have been given. Until next time, rest well and dream of feasts yet to come. Part 4: Adulterated Food and Drink. In the dimly lit streets of a medieval city, a baker surreptitiously glances left and right before ducking back into his shop. He pulls out a sack of sawdust and begins kneading it into the dough, stretching his paltry supply of flour. For many bakers, this deception was the only way to eke out a meager living. Bread was the lifeblood of the medieval diet, but its purity was often compromised. Unscrupulous bakers would add fillers like ground acorns, chalk, or sawdust to extend their dough. What resulted was a coarse, gritty loaf that offered little nutrition. The very staple that sustained peasants through their backbreaking labor had become yet another hardship to endure. Ale and wine, too, fell victim to the desperation of the times. Alewives and innkeepers, struggling to turn a profit, would water down their brew to stretch it further. The resulting drink was a thin, sour swill that bore little resemblance to the hearty ale that was the pride of the British Isles. One such alewife, Elizabeth, toils over her bubbling cauldron, stirring in yet another bucket of cloudy water. Her children hover near, their hungry eyes watching each drip, knowing their next meal depends on this batch. As she ladles out a mug of the watered-down brew, she sighs, remembering the rich, full-bodied ale her grandmother once crafted, a family recipe now lost to necessity. In a time when clean drinking water was a rarity, this adulterated ale and wine became an unfortunate necessity. Wells and rivers were often contaminated by human and animal waste, making them rife with disease. The alcohol in these drinks, though diluted, was still potent enough to kill some of the harmful bacteria. And so, peasants were forced to choose between risking the sickness of tainted water or the empty calories of watered-down ale. Attempts were made to curb these deceptive practices. The Assize of Bread and Ale, a 13th-century law, set strict regulations on the price, weight, and quality of bread and ale. Transgressors faced hefty fines or even time in the pillory, but with the limited means of enforcement and the desperation of the poor, these laws did little to stem the tide of food adulteration. And so, the medieval peasant's lot was one of constant compromise, a balancing act between the gnawing pain of hunger and the bitter disappointment of adulterated food. Each mouthful was a reminder of their precarious existence, where even the most basic sustenance could not be taken for granted. As we delve further into the realities of medieval food, we must remember that these were not just historical facts but the daily struggles of real people. In our next chapter, we'll explore how the very spaces in which they lived contributed to the challenges they faced in securing a decent meal. The close quarters shared by man and beast and the lack of sanitation that plagued medieval cities made the simple act of eating a perilous proposition. Part 5: Unsanitary Conditions. Picture, if you will, a small, thatched cottage huddled against the chill of a medieval winter. Inside, a family huddles around a meager fire, their breath mingling with the steam rising from a bubbling pot of pottage. In the corner, a pig roots through the rushes covering the dirt floor. It snorts and grunts, a constant backdrop to the family's daily life. This was the reality for many medieval peasants, a life lived in close quarters with their livestock. Animals were often kept inside the home for warmth and safety, their dung and debris mingling with the straw and rushes that served as the only floor covering. It was a breeding ground for disease, with fleas and lice thriving in the unsanitary conditions. Even in the grandest castles, sanitation was a challenge. Without a proper understanding of hygiene, even the most lavish feasts could end in tragedy. The story of King John of England serves as a poignant example. In 1216, while traveling across the country, the king fell ill after consuming a surfeit of peaches. Historians now believe these peaches were likely spoiled, leading to a case of dysentery that ultimately claimed the king's life. In the crowded cities of medieval Europe, the situation was even more dire. Narrow streets were choked with garbage and human waste, tainting the air and seeping into the water supply. In London, the River Thames served as both a source of drinking water and a dumping ground for the city's refuse. It's little wonder that disease ran rampant, with outbreaks of dysentery, typhoid, and even the dreaded Black Death. The Black Death, which swept through Europe in the 14th century, was in part able to spread so quickly and claim so many lives due to the unsanitary conditions of medieval cities. Fleas, carried by the rats that thrived in the filth, became the unwitting harbingers of the plague, spreading the disease from person to person with terrifying efficiency. For the average peasant, there was little escape from these unsanitary conditions. They lived and died amidst the filth, their bodies weakened by malnutrition and constant exposure to disease. Even the simple act of eating, which should have been a source of nourishment and comfort, became a gamble with every bite. As we consider these realities, it's easy to feel a sense of despair for the plight of the medieval peasant. But amidst this darkness, there were glimmers of light, the kindness of neighbors sharing what little they had, the solace found in faith and community. In our next chapter, we'll explore how the church, despite its own role in the hardships of the time, also offered a measure of relief and hope to the hungry and the downtrodden. Part 6: The Influence of the Church. The tolling of church bells marked the rhythm of life in medieval Europe. For peasants toiling in the fields, these peals signaled not just a call to prayer but also a reprieve from the unrelenting demands of their work and their hunger. In a world where so much was uncertain, the church stood as a bastion of stability and authority. But this authority came with its own set of rules and restrictions, many of which centered around food. The Catholic Church mandated frequent fasting and meatless days, particularly during the penitential season of Lent. For 40 days before Easter, the faithful were expected to abstain from meat, dairy, and eggs, a tall order for those already struggling to put food on the table. The story of one peasant family illustrates the hardship these fasts could impose. John and his wife Margaret toiled from sunup to sundown on their small plot of land, barely growing enough to feed their 3 children. When Lent arrived, they faced a daunting choice: honor the fast and risk weakening their already malnourished bodies, or defy the church and face the consequences for their immortal souls. In the end, they chose to follow the fast, subsisting on meager portions of bread, pottage, and the occasional dried fish. By Easter, their faces were gaunt and their steps heavy with exhaustion, yet they took solace in the belief that their suffering would be rewarded in the next life. Despite the additional hardships these fasts imposed, the church was not entirely deaf to the plight of the poor. Monasteries and abbeys often served as a source of food aid, distributing bread and alms to the needy as a form of Christian charity. The monks, with their vast lands and resources, were able to provide a measure of relief to the hungry masses. Yet, even this charity had its limits. When crops failed and famine struck, the demand for aid often outstripped the church's ability to provide. And for those caught poaching in the royal forests, a desperate attempt to supplement their meager diets with fresh game, the church's mercy was noticeably absent. Poachers, if caught, faced severe punishments, from maiming to death, regardless of their circumstances. And so, the church's influence on medieval food was a double-edged sword. It provided solace and aid to some while imposing additional burdens on others. For the peasant family, faith was both a source of strength and a further trial to endure in the face of unrelenting hunger. As we turn our gaze to the final chapter of our journey through medieval food, we will witness a scene of shocking contrast: the opulent feast of a noble household against the backdrop of peasant hardship. These lavish displays serve as a stark reminder of the vast inequalities that defined the era. Part 7. The Rare Medieval Feast. The great hall of the castle is alive with the flicker of 100 candles. Tapestries line the walls, their vibrant threads telling stories of heroic deeds and courtly love. At the head of the room, on a raised dais, the lord and lady preside over a scene of opulence and plenty. Down the center of the hall stretches a massive oak table, groaning under the weight of countless dishes. Whole roasted pigs, their skins crackling and golden, jostle for space with elegant silver platters of delicately spiced peacock. Baskets overflow with fresh-baked manchet bread, each loaf as white and soft as a cloud. The air is thick with the aroma of saffron, cinnamon, and cloves, spices so precious they're worth their weight in gold. In the castle kitchens, the master cook orchestrates a symphony of culinary creation. He barks orders at his underlings, who scurry to baste the meats, stir the pots, and plate the elaborate subtleties, sugar sculptures crafted into fanciful shapes of castles and unicorns. For the cook, this feast is a chance to showcase his artistry and ingenuity, to solidify his reputation and secure his place in his lord's favor. As the feast progresses, the diners gorge themselves on a seemingly endless parade of dishes. They tear into the tender flesh of roast venison, sup on creamy almond soup, and savor the delicate flavor of blancmange, a dish of shredded chicken mixed with rice, milk, and sugar. They wash it all down with goblets of richly spiced wine and frothy ale. But even amidst this revelry, there are reminders of the precariousness of medieval life. A noblewoman, her face flushed with wine, suddenly pales and excuses herself from the table, her stomach churning from the richness of the food. A knight, his teeth rotting from the sugary delicacies, bites into a particularly tough piece of meat and winces in pain. And hovering at the edges of the hall, the serving staff watch the excesses of their betters with a mixture of envy and resentment. They know that tomorrow they'll be back to their usual fare of coarse bread and thin gruel, the memory of this feast a taunting reminder of the gulf between their world and that of their masters. As the last plates are cleared and the final crumbs are swept away, we're left to ponder the stark contrasts of medieval food. For the nobility, feasts were a display of wealth, status, and power, a chance to revel in the finest delicacies the land had to offer. But for the vast majority, food was a daily struggle, a constant battle against scarcity, adulteration, and disease. In our modern world of abundance and choice, it's easy to forget the hardships faced by our medieval ancestors. But by understanding their struggles, we gain a deeper appreciation for the comforts we enjoy today. So, as we sit down to our own meals, let us take a moment to savor not just the flavors on our tongues but the hard-won progress that allows us to eat with such ease and variety. And so, as we close the book on this exploration of medieval food, let us do so with a sense of gratitude and perspective. For in the grand tapestry of human history, our own time is but a brief and privileged chapter, woven from the threads of countless lives lived and meals shared, each one a testament to the enduring resilience of the human spirit. As we've journeyed through the landscape of medieval food, we've encountered a world of scarcity, hardship, and inequality. From the bland monotony of peasant pottage to the dangerous fillers and adulterated bread, the challenges of feeding oneself in the Middle Ages were unrelenting. We've seen how the lack of variety in spices, the difficulties of preservation, the unbalanced diets, and the unsanitary conditions all conspired to make medieval food a far cry from the cornucopias we enjoy today. We've witnessed the impact of the Church's fasting edicts, adding spiritual burdens to the already heavy load of the poor. And we've marveled at the opulent feasts of the nobility, a glittering contrast to the grim realities faced by most. But through it all, we've also seen glimmers of humanity's indomitable spirit, the ingenuity of cooks making the most of meager ingredients, the solidarity of communities sharing what little they had, and the solace found in the rituals of faith and feast. In our modern world, it's easy to take for granted the abundance and variety of our food. We can walk into a supermarket and find fruits from South America, spices from Asia, and cheeses from Europe, all neatly packaged and ready to eat. We can dine in restaurants serving cuisines from around the globe or have a world of flavors delivered right to our doorstep. But imagine for a moment transporting a medieval peasant into the aisles of a modern grocery store. The sheer variety would be overwhelming, the vibrant colors of the produce section, the gleaming refrigerated cases filled with milk and eggs, the shelves upon shelves of prepackaged meals and snacks. It would be like stepping into a fairy tale, a land of unimaginable plenty. And yet, even in our world of culinary riches, we still face our own challenges. We grapple with the environmental impact of our food systems, with issues of access and inequality, and with the health consequences of overabundance. In our quest for convenience and choice, we sometimes forget the value of simplicity, of seasonal eating and local flavors. Perhaps, then, there are lessons to be learned from our medieval ancestors. Even as we appreciate how far we've come, we can embrace the joy of sharing a meal with loved ones, the satisfaction of a dish made with care and creativity. We can remember the value of preserving and cherishing the bounty of the earth, rather than taking it for granted. And most of all, we can approach our own meals with a sense of gratitude and wonder, recognizing the incredible journey that food has taken to reach our plates, from the sun-drenched fields to the bustling kitchens to the warmth of our own tables. Each bite is a testament to the resilience and ingenuity of the human spirit across the ages. So, as we end our journey through the annals of medieval food, let us raise a glass, or perhaps a humble wooden cup, to the countless generations who came before us. Through their struggles and triumphs, their hunger and their hopes, they laid the foundation for the world we inhabit today. And in honoring their legacy, we can find the wisdom and perspective to build a future where all may eat with joy, with dignity, and with plenty. As the royal cook bustled about the castle kitchens, preparing an extravagant feast, most of his fellow countrymen could only dream of such opulence. For the serf toiling in the fields, a meal was a simple affair of coarse bread and pottage, a thin stew of whatever vegetables or scraps could be found. On a good day, there might be a bit of salted pork or dried fish to add some flavor to the gruel-like mix, but more often than not, it was a bland and unsatisfying fare that left the belly only half full. The life of a peasant in medieval times was one of unrelenting hardship, and nowhere was this more apparent than in their daily sustenance. While the nobles dined on exotic dishes flavored with costly spices from far-off lands, the common folk subsisted on a diet that was as monotonous as it was meager. But even the privileged were not immune to the perils of medieval food. The lavish feasts that were the hallmark of aristocratic life often came with a hidden cost. With no means of refrigeration, food spoilage was a constant threat, and many a noble fell ill or even died from consuming contaminated fare. The very excess that was meant to showcase their wealth and status could prove to be their undoing. Such was the fate of King John of England, whose untimely death in 1216 was attributed to a surfeit of peaches. As the story goes, the king was traveling through the town of King's Lynn when he was seized by a terrible case of dysentery. Some say it was brought on by the rich food he had consumed at a nearby abbey, while others blamed the peaches he had eaten with relish. Whatever the cause, the king's condition quickly worsened, and he died a few days later, his reign cut short by a humble fruit. It is a testament to the precariousness of life in the Middle Ages that even the most powerful and privileged were not safe from the dangers that lurked in their food. For the vast majority of people, however, the risks were even greater. In a world where hunger was a constant companion, the temptation to eat spoiled or contaminated food was often too great to resist. This was especially true in times of dearth, when crops failed and food was scarce. During these lean years, people would resort to eating whatever they could find, even if it meant risking their health or even their lives. Acorns, grass, and other wild plants were often ground into a coarse flour to make bread, while animals that had died of disease were sometimes consumed out of desperation. Even in the best of times, medieval food was often adulterated in ways that would be unthinkable today. Unscrupulous bakers would stretch their dough with fillers like sawdust or chalk, while brewers would water down their ale to increase their profits. Such practices were not only dishonest but also dangerous, as they could lead to serious illness or even death. The alewife who sold her brew in the village tavern was a common figure in medieval life and one who often bore the brunt of the community's suspicions and resentments. If her ale was weak or sour, she might be accused of adulterating it with noxious substances or even of practicing witchcraft. In a world where superstition held sway, the line between a bad batch of ale and a deadly poison was often blurred. Despite the many challenges and hardships that medieval people faced in their daily lives, they were not without their small joys and comforts. For the peasant family gathered around the hearth at the end of a long day, a simple meal of bread and pottage could be a moment of respite and togetherness. And for the monks and nuns who dedicated their lives to prayer and service, the austere diet prescribed by their religious orders could be a source of spiritual nourishment and discipline. But even in the monasteries and abbeys that dotted the medieval landscape, food was not always a source of comfort or sustenance. During the holy season of Lent, when Christians were expected to fast and abstain from meat, the already limited diets of the religious orders would be further restricted. For 40 long days, they would subsist on little more than bread, water, and the occasional vegetable or fish. For some, this period of deprivation was a welcome opportunity to focus on their spiritual lives and to draw closer to God. But for others, it was a time of great hardship and temptation, as the pangs of hunger gnawed at their resolve and tested their faith. In a world where food was so often scarce and unpredictable, the idea of voluntarily giving it up must have seemed like the height of insanity. And yet, despite all the hardships and challenges that medieval people faced in their daily lives, they found ways to adapt and persevere. They learned to preserve their food through salting, smoking, and drying, to make the most of the meager ingredients available to them, and to find joy and comfort in the simple pleasures of life. In many ways, the story of medieval food is a story of resilience and ingenuity in the face of adversity. It is a reminder of how far we have come in terms of food safety, variety, and abundance, but also of how much we still have in common with our ancestors. For just as they struggled to put food on the table and to nourish their families, so too do we grapple with the challenges of our own time, from climate change and food insecurity to the pressures of modern life. As we sit down to our own meals, laden with a dizzying array of flavors and ingredients from all corners of the globe, it is easy to forget the hardships and sacrifices that have brought us to this point. But by understanding the history of our food and the ways in which it has shaped our culture and our identity, we can gain a greater appreciation for the abundance and diversity that we enjoy today. So, the next time you bite into a juicy apple or savor a slice of warm, crusty bread, take a moment to reflect on the long and winding road that has brought us to this point. And give thanks for the countless generations of farmers, cooks, and laborers who have toiled to put food on our tables and who have left us a legacy of resilience, creativity, and hope in the face of even the greatest of challenges. Perhaps, if a medieval peasant were to somehow be transported to a modern grocery store, they would be overwhelmed by the sheer abundance and variety of food available. They might marvel at the exotic fruits and vegetables from far-off lands, the gleaming displays of meat and fish, and the aisles upon aisles of packaged and processed foods. But they might also feel a sense of unease or even distrust, wondering at the hidden costs and compromises that have made such abundance possible. They might question the methods by which our food is grown and raised, the additives and preservatives that keep it fresh and appealing, and the impact that our food choices have on our health, our environment, and our communities. In the end, the medieval peasant might simply shake their head in wonder and return to their own time, content with the simple fare that has sustained them for generations. For while our modern food system may offer us greater choice and convenience than ever before, it is not without its own challenges and drawbacks. And just as the medieval peasant had to learn to make do with what they had, to find joy and sustenance in the face of scarcity and hardship, so too must we learn to navigate the complexities of our own food landscape. We must learn to make choices that nourish not only our bodies but also our souls, that honor the sacrifices and struggles of those who came before us, and that leave a legacy of health and abundance for generations to come. So, let us raise a toast to the humble peasant, the hard-working farmer, the skilled artisan, and all those who have labored to put food on our tables throughout history. Let us savor the flavors and textures of the foods we eat, not just as a source of sustenance but as a connection to the past and a promise for the future. And let us never forget the power of food to bring us together, to nourish our bodies and our spirits, and to remind us of our shared humanity in the face of even the greatest of challenges. As we've seen, the medieval spice trade was a lucrative but perilous business. Those who controlled the flow of spices could amass great fortunes, while those who toiled to bring these precious commodities to Europe risked life and limb. One such spice merchant was a man named Giovanni de Marignali, born in the early 14th century to a noble Florentine family. Giovanni seemed destined for a life of ease and comfort, but a restless spirit and a thirst for adventure led him down a different path. In 1338, Giovanni set out on a journey that would take him across the known world, from the bustling ports of Italy to the distant lands of China and India. As a papal envoy and missionary, his official purpose was to spread the Christian faith, but Giovanni was also a keen businessman, always on the lookout for valuable spices and other exotic goods to bring back to Europe. Giovanni's travels were fraught with danger at every turn. He crossed the vast deserts of Central Asia, braving sandstorms and bandits. He navigated treacherous mountain passes in the Himalayas, battling altitude sickness and frostbite. He sailed the storm-tossed seas of the Indian Ocean, praying to survive each monsoon season. But for all the hardships he endured, Giovanni was also enchanted by the wonders he encountered. He marveled at the gleaming white palaces of Khanbalik, the Mongol capital, later known as Beijing. He admired the pious devotion of the Taoist Christians in southern India. He reveled in the heady scents and flavors of the spice markets in Calicut and Malabar. Along the way, Giovanni gathered a rich cargo of cinnamon, pepper, cloves, and nutmeg, carefully packed in chests to protect them from moisture on the long journey home. He knew that if he could bring these spices safely back to Italy, he stood to make a fortune. But Giovanni's luck was not to hold. According to some accounts, his ship was lost at sea on the return voyage, taking him and his precious spices down to the briny deep. Other tales hold that he survived the journey, only to be robbed and murdered by brigands on the outskirts of Florence, his spices scattered to the wind. Whatever the truth of his fate, Giovanni de Marignali's story reminds us of the incredible risks and rewards of the medieval spice trade. For a few wealthy merchants and lucky adventurers, spices could be a ticket to untold riches, but for most, like Giovanni, they remained a tantalizing dream, always just out of reach. As we drift off to sleep, let us imagine we are in a bustling spice market in some far-flung corner of the medieval world. The air is thick with the scent of pepper and cinnamon, cardamom and saffron. Merchants haggle in a dozen different tongues, their voices rising and falling like the tide. We wander the narrow lanes, baskets in hand, marveling at the colorful mounds of spices from every corner of the globe. Here, a pile of ginger root, gnarled and pungent; there, a heap of cloves like tiny brown nails, their aroma warm and sweet. But as we fill our baskets, we can't help but feel a pang of regret for the many who will never taste these flavors. For the poor peasants back home, a pinch of pepper would be an unthinkable luxury, let alone a fragrant curry or a spiced wine. Their food, as we'll explore further, is a monotonous grind of gruel and grit, a far cry from the sumptuous feasts we've seen at the tables of the wealthy. But even those lavish banquets, as we'll soon discover, could come with their own hidden dangers and disgusting surprises. So, let us savor this imagined abundance, this rare sensory delight, as we drift deeper into dreams. For when we wake, we'll have to confront once more the harsh realities of food in the Middle Ages, realities that made filling one's belly a daily battle for princes and paupers alike. The scarcity and hardship that defined medieval food for the masses extended even to the staples that formed the backbone of their diets. Bread, the most basic and universal of foods, was often a coarse, unappetizing loaf that would be nearly unrecognizable today. For poorer peasants, bread was made from lower quality grains like barley, rye, and even beans or chestnuts in times of shortage. This resulted in dense, dark loaves that were difficult to digest and provided little nutrition. The bread was often full of gritty impurities from poor milling techniques, and it would quickly go stale or moldy in the damp conditions of many peasant homes. Even for slightly better-off peasants who could afford wheat bread, the end product was a far cry from the fluffy, leavened loaves we enjoy today. Leavening agents like yeast were expensive and hard to come by, so most bread was unleavened flatbread, similar to modern pita. These flatbreads would be baked on a hearthstone or dried in the sun, resulting in a hard, cracker-like consistency. The quality of bread was so important that it was often used as a marker of social class. The whitest, finest loaves, made from pure wheat flour, were reserved for the nobility, while the grayish-brown loaves of the peasantry were derided as black bread. In some regions, strict laws even prohibited commoners from consuming white bread, reserving it as a privilege of the elite. One figure who stood out in the history of medieval bread production was the 12th century mystic Saint Hildegard of Bingen. Born into a noble family in what is now Germany, Hildegard entered the monastic life as a young girl and rose to become the abbess of her own community. In addition to her visionary spiritual writings and musical compositions, Hildegard was renowned for her knowledge of herbalism and natural medicine. She wrote extensively about the properties of grains and the importance of proper nutrition, even at a time when such ideas were not widely understood. In her treatise Physica, Hildegard described spelt, an ancient grain closely related to wheat, as the best grain for human consumption. She believed that spelt bread nourished the body and enhanced longevity, while cautioning against the consumption of raw cereals as damaging to health. Hildegard put her knowledge into practice, overseeing the extensive agricultural lands and bakery of her abbey. Under her guidance, the nuns of Bingen produced high-quality spelt bread that was distributed to the sick and poor in the surrounding community. Though spelt was still a luxury commodity out of reach for most peasants, Hildegard's advocacy of it as a healthier alternative to common wheat was remarkably prescient. Modern nutritional science has vindicated many of her claims, showing spelt to be higher in protein and easier to digest for many people than highly processed modern wheat. The life and work of Hildegard of Bingen provides a glimpse into the crucial role that bread played in medieval society, not just as a staple food but as a symbol of social status and a potential tool for healing. Despite the efforts of visionaries like Hildegard, bread for most people in the Middle Ages remained a coarse, bland staple that was often scarce. The unequal distribution of this basic necessity was just one more way in which the stark class divides of medieval society manifested in its food culture. For the poorest peasants, even the meager comfort of a regular supply of bread could be stripped away by the cruel twists of fate and weather. In times of drought, flood, or blight, when grain crops failed, the specter of famine loomed large over medieval communities. During these dreaded years of dearth, food prices would skyrocket while wages plummeted, leaving many peasants unable to afford even a basic subsistence. With no social safety net to rely on, the poorest were left to starve or resort to desperate measures like eating bark, grass, or even cannibalism in the most extreme cases. One of the worst famines to strike medieval Europe was the Great Famine of 1315 to 1322. A catastrophic confluence of factors, including climate change, crop failures, and the economic fallout of endless wars, plunged the continent into a 7-year period of starvation and misery. Chronicles of the time paint a grim picture of the suffering endured by the common people. Men ate dogs, horses, cats, and other unclean things, wrote the Flemish monk William of Nantes. Some men, it was said, compelled by hunger, ate the bodies of executed criminals, and some poor people even ate their own children. The famine hit the Low Countries and Scandinavia particularly hard, with mortality rates as high as 10 to 25% in some regions. In the German city of Erfurt, the famine years saw an average of 16 deaths per day, compared to just 2 per day in normal times. Even in the best of times, the threat of hunger was never far away for medieval peasants. Their precarious existence, always at the mercy of the elements and the whims of their lords, meant that food insecurity was a constant companion. The grim reality of famine cast a long shadow over the medieval world, serving as a reminder of the fragility of life in an era before modern agriculture and social welfare. It was a world where even the most basic necessity of bread could not be taken for granted, and where the specter of starvation lurked just one bad harvest away. As we continue our journey through the culinary landscape of the Middle Ages, we'll see how this pervasive scarcity and insecurity shaped not just the diets but the entire worldview of medieval people. In a time when a full belly was a luxury and a stale crust a treasure, food took on a significance that is hard to imagine from our modern vantage point of abundance and choice. But first, let's turn our attention to another staple of the medieval diet that was scarcely more appetizing than the era's bread: meat. For all but the wealthiest nobles, meat was a rare treat, reserved for special occasions. And when it did appear on the menu, it often came in forms that would turn the stomachs of modern diners. In the absence of refrigeration, medieval people had to rely on a variety of preservation methods to keep meat from spoiling. Salting was the most common technique, with heavily salted meats being a staple of winter diets. But the salt itself was often of poor quality, full of impurities that could make the meat taste bad or even cause illness. Smoking and drying were also used to preserve meats, particularly in the form of sausages and hams. These could keep for longer periods but would become hard and unappetizing over time, with a texture more akin to leather than to the juicy, tender meats we enjoy today. For most peasants, meat usually meant tough, stringy cuts from older animals that were no longer useful for milk or labor. Beef was rarely eaten by commoners, as cattle were simply too valuable to slaughter. Pork and poultry were somewhat more common but were still luxury items for most. The type and amount of meat in medieval diets varied significantly by region and social status. In Slavic regions and parts of Scandinavia, people largely relied on freshwater fish rather than terrestrial meat. Hunting was a cherished privilege of the nobility, who jealously guarded their exclusive rights to venison and other game meats. One vivid glimpse into the inequality of medieval meat consumption comes from the records of King Richard II's cooks in the late 14th century. For a single royal feast in 1387, the kitchens prepared 2,000 chickens, 400 sheep, 500 stags, and 1,000 little pigs, fare fit for a king indeed. In contrast, a peasant family might expect to eat meat only a handful of times per year, usually on major religious holidays like Christmas and Easter. Even then, the cuts would be meager and have been scrupulously saved for months. But for one brief moment in the history of medieval England, the humble peasantry got a taste of the bounty usually reserved for their betters. In the aftermath of the Black Death, which killed up to half the population in the mid-14th century, the massive labor shortage gave surviving peasants newfound bargaining power. With fewer mouths to feed and a surplus of land, many peasants found themselves in the novel position of being able to demand higher wages and better living conditions. For a few short decades, the standard of living for English commoners actually improved markedly. Meat consumption rose as more peasants could afford to keep livestock for their own tables rather than for the markets. Wages doubled or even tripled in some regions, allowing laboring families to supplement their usual fare of porridge and bread with the occasional chicken, pig, or even cow. But this golden age for the peasantry was to be short-lived. The landed nobility, alarmed at the rising power of the lower classes, fought back with laws attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and tie peasants to the land. The tensions between the emboldened peasantry and the reactionary aristocracy would erupt in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Though the revolt was brutally suppressed, with its leaders executed and its gains largely rolled back, it stands as a testament to the transformative impact of the Black Death on medieval society. For a brief, shining moment, the common people of England got a taste of a life less constrained by scarcity and toil. But for most of the Middle Ages, and for most people, meat remained a rare and coveted treat. Its scarcity made it a potent symbol of status and wealth, a tangible reminder of the chasm between the haves and have-nots. In the great halls of castles and manors, nobles and knights feasted on heaping platters of roasted game and delicate fowl, washing it down with fine wines and honeyed mead. But in the hovels of the peasantry, a scrap of salted pork or a stringy chicken leg was a hard-won delicacy, to be savored and stretched as far as it could go. This disparity in access to such a basic foodstuff underscores the harsh inequalities that defined life in the Middle Ages. In a world where even a full belly was a mark of privilege, the gulf between rich and poor was as wide as the distance between a king's banquet table and a peasant's empty trencher. As we've seen, the rare morsel of meat was a highlight in the otherwise dreary and monotonous diet of most medieval people. But even this small pleasure was subject to strict regulation by the power of the Church. In medieval Europe, the Catholic Church wielded immense influence over every aspect of daily life, and food was no exception. The church calendar was dotted with fast days and meatless days, when the consumption of animal products was strictly forbidden. The most significant of these was the season of Lent, the 40-day period leading up to Easter. During this time, all meat, dairy, and eggs were off limits, leaving the faithful to subsist on a meager diet of fish, vegetables, and bread. For wealthy nobles, this was a minor inconvenience. They could afford to import exotic fruits, nuts, and spices to liven up their Lenten fare, and their well-stocked fish ponds ensured a steady supply of fresh seafood. But for the poor, Lent meant an even more restricted and monotonous diet than usual. The Church's rationale for these dietary restrictions was rooted in the idea of penance and spiritual discipline. By denying themselves the pleasures of the flesh, even in the form of food, the faithful were thought to be purifying their souls and aligning themselves with the suffering of Christ. But in a world where hunger and scarcity were daily realities for most people, the idea of voluntary deprivation must have seemed a bitter irony. For peasants who rarely tasted meat anyway, the imposition of additional restrictions could feel like a cruel joke. Yet, the power of the Church was so great that few dared to openly flout its dietary decrees. To do so was to risk not just social ostracism but the very real threat of eternal damnation. In a time when the afterlife was considered more real and important than earthly existence, this was a potent deterrent indeed. One poignant tale that illustrates the hardships of Lenten fasting comes from the records of a 14th-century English manor. In 1322, a peasant woman named Agnes Paton was brought before the manorial court on charges of stealing 2 loaves of bread during Lent. In her defense, Agnes pleaded that she had stolen the bread to feed her starving children, who were too young to understand the rules of the fast. She begged for mercy, arguing that surely God would not want her innocent babes to go hungry. The court, moved by her plea, took the unusual step of acquitting Agnes of the theft charge, but still admonished her for breaking the Lenten fast, reminding her that the needs of the soul must take precedence over the desires of the body. For Agnes and countless others like her, the rigid dietary restrictions of the Church must have seemed like just one more burden in a life already defined by hardship and hunger. In a world where food was scarce and survival precarious, the idea of willingly foregoing what little sustenance was available must have been difficult to swallow. But the Church's influence on medieval food culture wasn't entirely negative. Monasteries and abbeys were often at the forefront of agricultural innovation, pioneering new techniques for crop rotation, irrigation, and selective breeding. They also served as repositories of classical knowledge about agriculture and food preservation, keeping alive the wisdom of ancient Rome and Greece. Moreover, the Church played a vital role in providing food aid to the poor and hungry. Monasteries were known for their charitable distribution of bread and ale to the needy, and many operated hospitals and almshouses to care for the sick and destitute. In a time before social welfare programs or organized charity, the Church was often the only safety net available to the most vulnerable members of society. Its teachings about the virtues of charity and the sin of gluttony helped to create a moral imperative for those with means to share their bounty with the less fortunate. Of course, this charity was often mixed with a hefty dose of paternalism and moral judgment. The poor were expected to be grateful for whatever scraps they were given and to accept their lot in life as divinely ordained. But for those on the brink of starvation, even a small act of kindness could mean the difference between life and death. As the Middle Ages wore on, the culinary distance between the wealthy and the poor only grew wider. By the late 14th and 15th centuries, Europe was in the grips of what some historians have called the Little Ice Age, a period of cooler temperatures and frequent climatic disruptions. Crop yields declined as fields were battered by droughts, floods, and unseasonable frosts. Food prices skyrocketed, leaving many commoners unable to afford even basic staples. At the same time, the Black Death and subsequent waves of plague had decimated the population, leading to labor shortages and rising wages. In response, the nobility and emerging merchant class doubled down on conspicuous consumption as a way to display their wealth and status. Lavish banquets featuring exotic dishes and opulent displays of sugar sculptures and gilded peacocks became the order of the day. Meanwhile, the poor were left to survive on whatever meager scraps they could scrounge. In times of dearth, many were reduced to eating famine bread made from a desperate mix of peas, beans, acorns, and even sawdust. Others resorted to foraging for wild plants or hunting any animals they could catch, from rodents to crows. But even in the midst of this stark inequality, there were glimmers of hope and resistance. Peasant revolts, like the English Rising of 1381 or the German Bauernkrieg of the early 16th century, saw the common people rising up to demand better treatment and a fairer share of the wealth. While these uprisings were often brutally suppressed, they nonetheless testified to the unquenchable human spirit and the enduring dream of a world where everyone could enjoy the basic dignity of a full belly and a decent life. And in the kitchens and gardens of ordinary people, the seeds of a more vibrant and diverse food culture were being planted. Women, who bore the primary responsibility for feeding their families, were the unsung heroes of medieval cuisine. With creativity and resourcefulness, they found ways to coax flavor and nourishment out of even the humblest ingredients. In the folk traditions of pickling, preserving, and foraging, they passed down knowledge that would sustain their communities through the lean times and lay the foundation for the culinary revolutions to come. And in the communal ovens and shared meals of village life, they nurtured a spirit of solidarity and resilience that would prove as sustaining as any loaf of bread. So, while the story of food in the Middle Ages is undoubtedly one of hardship and deprivation, it is also a story of ingenuity, resilience, and hope. In the face of scarcity and oppression, medieval people found ways to nourish not just their bodies but their spirits, to find joy and communion in the simple act of sharing a meal. As we look back on this distant and often difficult past, we can take inspiration from their example. In a world that is still riven by inequality and hunger, their story reminds us of the fundamental human right to food and the vital importance of fighting for a more just and sustainable food system. And in our own kitchens and around our own tables, we can honor their legacy by cherishing the abundance we enjoy and remembering always to share it with those who have less. For in the end, the true measure of a society is not in the opulence of its feasts, but in the way it cares for its most vulnerable members. As we've seen, for the vast majority of people in medieval Europe, food was a daily struggle of scarcity, monotony, and even danger. But there was one place where the food was always abundant, always varied, and always exquisite: the royal court. While peasants subsisted on gruel and stale bread, nobles feasted on the finest delicacies the land had to offer. Imagine being the royal cook, entrusted with the monumental task of preparing lavish meals for the king and his court. Your day begins before dawn as you oversee the delivery of ingredients from far and wide. Wagons roll into the castle courtyard, laden with barrels of wine from Burgundy, wheels of cheese from the Alps, crates of spices from the Orient. The king's huntsmen ride in with deer and boar slung over their saddles, ready to be transformed into savory roasts and pies. In the cavernous castle kitchens, a small army of servants bustles about under your command. Fires roar in the great hearths as spits turn slowly, roasting meats to perfection. Cauldrons bubble with fragrant stews and soups, while bakers knead dough for bread and pastries. The air is thick with the aroma of exotic spices: cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, cardamom, each worth more than their weight in silver. As the hour of the feast approaches, you put the finishing touches on your creations: a magnificent roast swan, its plumed neck curving gracefully on the platter. A gleaming aspic studded with gems of fruit and topped with gold leaf, a towering subtlety in the shape of the king's coat of arms, painted in vibrant hues. Each dish is a work of art, crafted to delight the eye as much as the palate. When at last the noble guests file into the great hall and take their seats, it is time for your masterpieces to be unveiled. Servants parade the platters in, presenting each to the high table with a flourish. The guests ooh and ah as they are served, marveling at the bounty before them. For a few glorious hours, they dine like gods, sampling delicacies from every corner of the known world. But even here, in the rarefied realm of the royal court, the specter of illness lurks behind the splendor. For all their expense and artistry, even the most sumptuous dishes could harbor deadly spoilage. And the sheer excess of the feast often led to overindulgence, as nobles gorged themselves far past the point of satisfaction. It was not unheard of for a courtier to literally eat himself to death, felled by his own gluttony. So, while the royal feast may have stood in stark contrast to the meager rations of the common folk, it was not without its own perils. In a world without refrigeration or food safety standards, no one was truly safe from the dangers of the dining table, rich or poor. The medieval relationship with food was always a precarious one. Today, we can scarcely imagine the hardships that our ancestors endured simply to fill their bellies. The poorest among us have access to a variety and quality of food that would have been unthinkable even for medieval kings. We can walk into a gleaming supermarket and find fruits and vegetables from every season, meats and cheeses from every continent, spices and sauces from every cuisine. We can eat what we want, when we want, without fear of famine or food poisoning. But perhaps, in our abundance, we have lost something as well. The medieval peasant, for all his suffering, likely felt a deep connection to the land and the turning of the seasons. He knew intimately the sweat and toil that went into every mouthful. While we may pity him his limited options, he would likely look upon our prepackaged, mass-produced meals with a mixture of wonder and horror. One can imagine a medieval serf, transported to the snack aisle of a modern grocery store, marveling at the colorful bags and boxes stretching out before him. He picks up a shiny packet, turning it over in his withered hands. Cheetos, he reads slowly, sounding out the unfamiliar word. Made with real cheese. He shakes his head in disbelief. Real cheese, for a mere peasant. Impossible. He puts it back on the shelf and moves on, overwhelmed by the strange bounty of this new world. As we drift off to sleep, bellies full of whatever we desire, let us take a moment to reflect on the privilege of choice. Let us remember the countless generations who came before, who fought and scraped and starved so that we might have the luxury of a full larder. And let us be grateful for the simple, everyday miracle of enough to eat. As the sun set over the bustling port city of Venice, a weary spice merchant named Luca disembarked from his ship, his precious cargo of exotic spices from the east secured tightly in his satchel. Luca had spent months traversing the treacherous Silk Road, braving bandits, sandstorms, and searing heat to bring a taste of faraway lands to the tables of wealthy Europeans. For Luca and merchants like him, the spice trade was a lucrative but perilous endeavor. The demand for spices like pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and saffron was insatiable among the nobility, who used them to flavor their rich dishes and show off their affluence. But for the common folk, these fragrant seasonings remained an unattainable luxury, their meals remaining sadly bland and unappetizing. As Luca navigated the winding canals of Venice to deliver his wares to his wealthy clientele, he couldn't help but reflect on the stark divide between the opulent feasts of the rich and the meager rations of the poor. While nobles dined on succulent roasts flavored with exotic spices, peasants subsisted on little more than coarse bread and watery porridge, their palates never knowing the lively tang of pepper or the warm, sweet embrace of cinnamon. The life of a spice merchant was one of constant movement and danger, with fortunes won and lost on the whims of the sea and the shifting sands of the desert. Luca had seen his fair share of hardships on his journeys, attacks by marauding bandits, treacherous mountain passes, and the ever-present threat of disease. But he pressed on, driven by the promise of riches and the thrill of the unknown. As he made his final deliveries and counted his profits, Luca couldn't shake the feeling that, for all the wealth and prestige the spice trade brought him, it remained a bitter reminder of the deep inequalities that plagued medieval society. While he dined on saffron-infused stews and fragrant spiced wines, the common people went to bed with growling stomachs, their dreams haunted by the enticing aromas that wafted from the kitchens of the elite. With a heavy heart, Luca retired to his lavish villa for the night, knowing that tomorrow he would once again set sail for distant lands, chasing the promise of fortune and leaving behind a world where the simple pleasure of a flavorful meal remained an unattainable dream for most. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, a weary housewife named Matilda stirred from her slumber, her mind already racing with the countless tasks that lay ahead. For Matilda and countless other women across medieval Europe, the arrival of autumn heralded not a season of bountiful harvests and joyous feasts, but rather a time of ceaseless labor and gnawing anxiety about the looming specter of winter. With the days growing shorter and the nights turning colder, Matilda knew that she had precious little time to preserve what meager crops her family had managed to coax from the unyielding earth. Every scrap of food was precious, and nothing could be allowed to go to waste, lest they face the unthinkable prospect of starvation in the bleak months ahead. As she set about her work, Matilda's mind wandered to the lavish feasts of the nobility, where sumptuous meats and exotic delicacies were consumed with wanton abandon. For her and her fellow peasants, such extravagances were little more than cruel jests, taunting reminders of the vast chasm that separated the haves from the have-nots in the rigid hierarchy of medieval society. With calloused hands and an aching back, Matilda toiled from dawn until dusk, salting and smoking what little meat they had managed to raise, pickling vegetables in precious vinegar, and hanging herbs to dry in the rafters. The work was monotonous and exhausting, but she couldn't afford to rest, knowing that every morsel she preserved now could mean the difference between life and death come winter. As the days wore on and the leaves began to turn, Matilda's thoughts turned to the harsh realities that lay ahead. Even with all her hard work, she knew that the winter would be a time of scarcity and hardship, with meals consisting of little more than coarse bread and thin gruel, day after day. The specter of hunger was a constant companion, lurking just beyond the threshold, waiting to sink its icy claws into the vulnerable and the weak. But even in the face of such bleak prospects, Matilda found solace in the knowledge that her tireless efforts would at least give her family a fighting chance. With a fierce determination burning in her heart, she continued her labors, her hands raw and her spirit weary but her resolve unshakable. For in a world where famine and privation were constant threats, the simple act of preserving food was an act of defiance, a stubborn refusal to submit to the unyielding cruelty of fate. As the first snowflakes began to fall and the chill winds of winter swept across the land, Matilda could only pray that her labors had been enough. With a heavy heart and an empty larder, she prepared to face the long, dark months ahead, knowing that for her and countless others like her, the struggle for survival was only just beginning. In a grand castle nestled amidst rolling hills and verdant forests, a lavish feast was underway. The great hall filled with the raucous laughter and clinking of goblets as nobles from far and wide gathered to partake in an extravagant display of wealth and power. At the head of the table sat the lord of the manor, his bejeweled fingers tearing into a succulent roast swan, its delicate flesh flavored with exotic spices from distant lands. All around him, the tables groaned under the weight of countless delicacies, savory meat pies, rich stews, and decadent pastries, each one a testament to the skill of the castle's master chefs. The air was thick with the aroma of roasting meats and the heavy scent of mulled wine, a sensory feast that stood in stark contrast to the meager rations of the serfs toiling in the fields beyond the castle walls. For these lowly peasants, the very notion of such a feast was little more than a cruel fantasy, a tantalizing glimpse of a world forever beyond their reach. As they huddled in their drafty hovels, their bellies gnawing with hunger, they could only dream of the rich flavors and sumptuous textures that graced the tables of their betters. Their own meals, if they could even be called that, consisted of little more than a thin gruel made from whatever scraps and leftovers they could scrounge together. A few lucky ones might have a meager crust of bread to gnaw on, but for most, even that was a rare luxury. The thought of meat, let alone the succulent delicacies being devoured by the nobles, was little more than a distant fantasy. As the feast wore on and the wine flowed freely, the nobles grew ever more boisterous, their laughter ringing through the halls and echoing off the stone walls. They traded bawdy jokes and tales of their exploits, their faces flushed with the warmth of the fire and the satisfaction of their overindulged appetites. But beyond the castle walls, the serfs huddled in their misery, their stomachs cramping with hunger and their hearts heavy with the knowledge that they would likely never know the pleasures of a full belly or a contented smile. For them, life was little more than an endless cycle of backbreaking labor and gnawing hunger, the cruel whims of fate forever conspiring to keep them in their place. As the last embers of the feast's great fires died out and the nobles retired to their plush chambers, the serfs returned to their own meager dwellings, their minds haunted by the tantalizing aromas and raucous laughter that had filled the night air. With heavy hearts and empty stomachs, they settled in for another long, cold night, the specter of hunger their constant companion and the dream of a better life little more than a cruel, taunting mirage. In the bustling streets of a medieval town, an alewife named Agnes hurried to and fro, her arms laden with jugs of her latest brew. Agnes was a stout, no-nonsense woman who had been brewing ale for as long as anyone could remember. It was a hard life, fraught with long hours and meager profits, but it was the only life she had ever known. As she made her way through the winding alleys, dodging the refuse and filth that littered the streets, Agnes couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt over the shortcut she had taken with her latest batch. Times were tough, and the price of grain had skyrocketed, leaving her with little choice but to stretch her ale with a bit of extra water. It was a risky move, one that could land her in hot water with the local authorities if anyone found out. But what choice did she have? Agnes knew that her customers, mostly hard-working laborers and craftsmen, relied on her ale to provide a brief respite from the drudgery of their daily lives. They craved the rich, hearty flavor and the pleasant buzz that came with a few pints after a long day's work. But with the cost of ingredients eating into her already meager profits, Agnes had been forced to cut corners wherever she could. As she arrived at the tavern and began to unload her wares, Agnes couldn't shake the nagging feeling that she was betraying her customers' trust. She took pride in her craft, and the thought of serving them watered-down swill made her stomach churn. But what choice did she have? It was either adulterate her brew or risk losing everything she had worked so hard to build. With a heavy heart, Agnes began to serve her customers, watching as they eagerly quaffed down the subpar ale, their faces contorting in disappointment as they realized that something was amiss. Some grumbled under their breath, while others outright complained, demanding to know what had happened to the usually stellar brew. Agnes did her best to deflect their questions and assuage their concerns, but the guilt continued to gnaw at her. As the night wore on and the crowd began to thin, Agnes finally allowed herself a moment to breathe. She surveyed the empty jugs and the meager pile of coins on the counter, a bitter reminder of the harsh realities of her trade. With a weary sigh, she began to clean up, her mind already racing with worries about how she would make ends meet in the days to come. For Agnes and countless other aloes like her, the struggle to survive in a world of scarcity and hardship was a constant battle. Each day brought new challenges and difficult choices, and the line between right and wrong often blurred in the face of desperation. But still, they persevered, driven by the hope that someday, somehow, their hard work and sacrifice would pay off, and they would finally know the taste of a better life. In the grand halls of a medieval palace, a royal cook named Guillaume scurried about the kitchen, his brow furrowed in concentration as he oversaw the preparations for the evening's lavish feast. Guillaume was a master of his craft, renowned throughout the land for his ability to create culinary masterpieces that dazzled the senses and left even the most discerning palates in awe. As he moved from station to station, barking orders and sampling sauces, Guillaume couldn't help but feel a sense of pride at the opulence and extravagance that surrounded him. The kitchen was a hive of activity, with scullery maids and kitchen boys scurrying to and fro, their arms laden with the finest ingredients from across the realm. There were plump capons and succulent roasts, their skins glistening with honey and spices, mountains of fresh fruits and vegetables, their colors so vibrant they seemed to leap off the platters, and delicate pastries and confections, each one a work of art in its own right. It was a true testament to the wealth and power of the royal court, and Guillaume reveled in his role as the mastermind behind it all. But even as he basked in the glory of his creations, Guillaume couldn't shake the unease that gnawed at the back of his mind. He knew all too well the stark contrast between the lavish feasts he prepared for the nobility and the meager scraps that passed for meals among the common folk. It was a divide that troubled him deeply, though he knew that to speak out against it would be to risk everything he had worked so hard to achieve. As the final preparations were made and the first course was served, Guillaume watched from the shadows as the nobles took their seats, their faces alight with anticipation. He saw the way their eyes widened in delight as they tasted his creations, the appreciative murmurs and nods of approval that rippled through the crowd. For a moment, he allowed himself to bask in the satisfaction of a job well done. But as the night wore on and the revelry grew more boisterous, Guillaume couldn't shake the growing sense of unease that tugged at his heart. He thought of the countless hungry mouths beyond the palace walls, the gaunt faces and hollow eyes of those who had never known the pleasure of a full belly. As the last of the dishes were cleared away and the nobles retired to their chambers, their stomachs groaning with the excesses of the feast, Guillaume finally allowed himself a moment to rest. He slumped against the kitchen wall, his eyes closed and his heart heavy with the weight of the injustices he had witnessed. In that moment, he couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to live in a world where food was not a privilege reserved for the few but a basic right afforded to all. He knew that such a world was little more than a dream, a fantasy as distant and unattainable as the stars themselves. But still, he couldn't help but hope that someday, somehow, things might change, and the plenty he created in the palace kitchens might find its way to those who needed it most. Until then, Guillaume knew that he would continue to ply his trade, his hands forever stained with the guilt of the plenty he created and the poverty he helped perpetuate. It was a burden he would carry with him always, a constant reminder of the cruelty and inequality that lay at the heart of the medieval world. As we have journeyed through the annals of medieval history, exploring the harsh realities and cruel inequities that defined the era's food culture, it is impossible not to feel a sense of gratitude for the relative abundance and variety that we enjoy in the modern age. The struggles and hardships faced by our ancestors, from the lowliest serf to the most skilled artisan, serve as a poignant reminder of just how far we have come in our quest to ensure that all people have access to the basic necessities of life. But even as we celebrate the progress we have made, it is important to remember that the specter of hunger and malnutrition still looms large in many parts of the world. Even in the midst of plenty, there are still those who go to bed with empty stomachs and aching hearts, their dreams haunted by the same cruel inequalities that plagued the medieval world. As we reflect on the lessons of the past and the challenges of the present, it is clear that the fight for food justice is one that is far from over. It is a struggle that will require the collective efforts of all those who believe in the basic human right to nourishment and sustenance, a struggle that will test our resolve and our compassion in equal measure. But even in the face of such daunting odds, we must never lose sight of the progress we have made and the hope that sustains us. We must draw strength from the courage and resilience of those who came before us, those who toiled in the fields and labored in the kitchens, their hands calloused and their hearts heavy with the weight of their burdens. And we must continue to push forward, to fight for a world in which no one goes hungry and in which the bounty of the earth is shared equally among all those who call it home. It is a vision that may seem distant and unattainable, a dream as fragile and fleeting as the wisps of steam rising from a bowl of gruel. But it is a dream worth fighting for, a dream that has the power to transform the world and bring hope to the hearts of all those who hunger for a better tomorrow. So, let us go forth with renewed purpose and determination, armed with the knowledge of the past and the hope of the future. Let us work to build a world in which the plenty of the palace kitchens finds its way to the bellies of the poor, and in which the joys of the harvest are shared by all those who have labored to bring it to fruition. For in the end, the struggle for food justice is not just about filling stomachs and sating hunger. It is about the very essence of what it means to be human, about the bonds of compassion and empathy that bind us all together across the gulfs of time and space. It is a struggle that will require all of our strength and all of our courage, but it is a struggle that we cannot afford to lose. So, let us go forth with open hearts and willing hands, ready to do our part in the great work of building a world in which all people can know the simple joy of a full belly and a contented smile. For the peasants toiling in the fields from dawn to dusk, such extravagance was unimaginable. They subsisted on the most meager of meals, their bellies never fully sated. A typical repast might consist of a thin barley or rye porridge, known as pottage, accompanied by a hunk of dense, coarse bread. If they were fortunate, they might have a small scrap of hard cheese or a few shriveled peas to add some sustenance. Meat was a rare luxury, perhaps a bit of tough, stringy salted pork on a special occasion like Christmas or Easter. The lack of variety in the peasant diet was striking. While the nobility dined on delicacies from distant lands, the common folk made do with the same bland staples day after day. There was little to break the monotony, save for the changing of the seasons, which dictated what meager produce might be available. In the spring, tender greens like nettles or dandelions might provide a welcome respite from the usual fare. Come summer, a few precious fruits, small, hard apples or bitter crab apples, could be gathered from the woods. Autumn brought the harvest season, a time of backbreaking labor but also a brief abundance of fresh grains and perhaps a slaughtered hog or two to put up salt meat for the long winter ahead. Ah, winter, the leanest and most dreaded of seasons for the medieval peasant. As the days grew short and the nights bitter cold, families huddled around smoky hearths, bellies pinched with hunger. What little food remained from the harvest had to be carefully hoarded, doled out in small portions to make it last until spring. This was the time of year when the pottage grew thinner and more watery, the bread even harder and more tooth-breaking. Starvation was a constant specter, waiting to claim the weak and vulnerable. It's hard for us to imagine such a precarious existence, where a single failed crop could spell doom for an entire village. Yet, for most people in the Middle Ages, this was the grim reality of daily life. They lived at the mercy of the elements, the nobility, and the often cruel whims of fate. A mouth to feed was a burden as much as a blessing, another empty belly to fill from limited resources. Even those slightly higher up the social ladder, like skilled craftsmen or prosperous freemen, rarely enjoyed much better fare than their poorer neighbors. A bowl of pottage might be enriched with a bit of precious butter or a scrap of meat, but the fundamental monotony remained. The same could be said for the monks in their abbeys and monasteries. While they generally ate better than the laity, subsisting on bread, cheese, fish, and ale, their diet was still quite Spartan by modern standards. Rich spices and exotic ingredients were reserved for the tables of the nobility. Speaking of ale, it was the common drink of the Middle Ages, consumed by young and old alike. Clean drinking water was often scarce, and the fermentation process provided some protection against waterborne illnesses. But even this small comfort could be adulterated by unscrupulous brewers stretching their product with unsavory additives. Dishonest bakers might do the same with bread, mixing the precious wheat flour with cheaper grains, bran, or even sawdust and chalk. Such deceits were officially frowned upon and could be harshly punished if discovered, but the desperate realities of the time made them all too common. This was a world where food was a daily struggle, a relentless cycle of toil and hunger for all but a privileged few. The nobles in their grand halls, dining on elaborately prepared dishes and fine wines, seemed to inhabit an entirely different plane of existence from the grimy, half-starved peasants working their lands. It was a stark divide, one that bred resentment and sometimes open rebellion. But more often, it bred a sort of grim resignation and acceptance that this was simply the way things were. A peasant's lot was to suffer and endure, to eke out a meager living from an unforgiving land and hope for a better life in the hereafter. Yet, even in the midst of such hardship, there were small moments of respite and celebration. Holidays and feast days provided brief glimpses of plenty, when even the poorest might enjoy a bit of meat or a sweet pastry. Weddings, christenings, and other milestones were marked with communal meals, a chance for neighbors to come together and share what little they had. These fleeting moments of conviviality made the hard times more bearable, a reminder that even in the face of great tombs that pierced the vivid blue sky, a civilization that endured for over 3,000 years, leaving an indelible mark on human history. At the center of it all were the pharaohs, the divine rulers who wielded immense power and prestige, but behind the glittering facade of riches and royalty, the lives of these god-kings were often steeped in darkness, obsession, and shocking practices that may be hard for us to fathom today. Over the next hour or so, we'll be diving deep into the fascinating and often unsettling world of ancient Egyptian pharaohs. We'll explore their opulent daily lives inside sprawling palace complexes, their tangled webs of royal relationships and rivalries, and their unshakable belief in their own divinity. We'll also confront the pharaohs' fixation on death and the afterlife, which drove them to construct ever more elaborate tombs, andarary temples, and even led some to engage in the chilling practice of human sacrifice. By the end of our journey, we'll have encountered influential figures like Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, King Tut, and Ramses II, and traced the captivating mysteries modern archaeologists are still unraveling about their lives and times. It's a story of power, magic, obsession, and eternal legacies that have enthralled the world for centuries. So dim the lights, settle in, and let the intrigues of ancient Egypt softly whisk you away on the wings of history. But before we fully immerse ourselves in the distant past, let's first zoom out and take an ancient Egyptian civilization at its height, stretching from around 3100 BCE. To 30 BCE, ancient Egypt was one of the first and longest-lasting complex societies in human history. The kingdom was born when King Manus unified the disparate tribes of the lush Nile Valley into a single state, taking advantage of the river's fertile floodplains to fuel an agricultural revolution that would be the envy of the ancient world. Over the centuries, Egypt grew into a powerhouse of wealth, culture, and influence, its land stretching from the Mediterranean Sea to deep into Nubia in the south. The pharaohs presided over a centralized state with a sophisticated bureaucracy, groundbreaking technological advancements like the ox-drawn plow and sailboats, and a rich culture that produced timeless works of art, architecture, and literature. The Egyptians developed one of the world's earliest writing systems in the form of hieroglyphics, as well as a 365-day calendar that tracked the annual flooding of the Nile with uncanny precision. But perhaps their most visible and enduring achievements were the colossal monuments they left behind: the Great Pyramid's sprawling temple complexes and subterranean tombs hewn into cliffsides. These awe-inspiring feats of engineering served to project the godlike power and prestige of the pharaohs, while also hinting at the depths of their obsession with death and eternity. For the pharaohs, this earthly life was but a prelude to a glorious and well-provisioned immortality, and they would bend immense resources and human capital to securing their share of forever. At the center of this remarkable civilization were the pharaohs themselves, the divine kings who ruled as the living embodiment of the god Horus on earth. The pharaoh was the supreme authority in all matters of state, religion, and war, wielding a level of power and influence that would be almost unimaginable today. He, or in rare cases she, was responsible for maintaining order and balance in the cosmos, placating the gods with rituals and offerings, and ensuring the prosperity and protection of the Egyptian people. But this exalted status came with a dark side as well, as we'll soon discover. The pharaohs were bound by an intricate and often brutal web of rituals, superstitions, and obligations that governed every aspect of their lives and deaths, from the incestuous marriages they contracted to keep the royal bloodline pure, to the servants and pets they took with them into the grave, to the shocking acts of deification and human sacrifice. Some pharaohs engaged in the lives of these divine rulers were often steeped in as much darkness as light. So as we set off to explore the private lives and enduring legacy of some of history's most iconic and influential rulers, brace yourself for a journey into the captivating, beguiling, and at times disturbing world of the pharaohs of ancient Egypt. Let's begin by imagining a day in the life of a pharaoh at the height of the New Kingdom. Around 1500 BCE, dawn breaks gently over the shining limestone walls of the pharaoh's sprawling palace complex at Thebes. The king and his entourage, aroused from their sleep by the soft sound of blind musicians serenading the sunrise, as barefoot servants pad silently through torch-lit halls bearing trays of delicacies to break the royal fast in the palace's colonnaded courtyards. Songbirds flit among lush gardens and burbling fountains as tamed baboons and lion cubs lounge in the shade. The pharaoh emerges from his bedchamber accompanied by a series of body servants who have spent the last hour attending to his elaborate grooming regimen. They've shaved his head and body silky smooth to stave off lice, lined his eyes with striking kohl and green malachite, and anointed his limbs with fragrant oils and perfumes. Gold and electrum gleam at his throat and wrists, while an exquisite crown in the shape of a falcon encircles his brow, a symbol of his divine kinship with the god Horus. Thus arrayed in all his finery, the living god strides forth to begin his packed schedule of daily duties and devotions. First on the agenda is a visit to the palace shrine to make offerings and libations to the chief gods Re, the sun god Osiris, the god of the underworld, and the pharaoh's own deified ancestors. Chanting priests fill the incense-perfumed air with hymns and prayers as the king prostrates himself before the serene painted gazes of the gods. With his religious obligations discharged, the pharaoh convenes his council to hear petitions, dispense judgments, and consult on affairs of state. Seated on a golden throne, he listens as his vizier reads out the day's business, boundary disputes to settle, trade agreements to negotiate, construction projects to oversee. Though he solicits advice from his most trusted courtiers, the final word on all matters ultimately rests with him. The day wears on in a blur of ceremonies and spectacles designed to awe the populace and reinforce the pharaoh's divine right to rule. The king processes through the city in a magnificent chariot, the cheers of his subjects rising like a wave as he showers them with gifts of gold and grain. He officiates over the ritual opening of a new temple, driving in the first peg with a golden mallet as priests chant incantations to seal the sacred space. But even in these moments of public triumph, an undercurrent of dark superstition and obsessive ritual runs beneath the surface. The pharaoh is careful to always enter a room right foot first, to ward off evil spirits. He eats only with his left hand, reserving his right for communing with the gods, and he never ever allows his shadow to fall across a priest or a statue of a deity, lest he incur divine wrath that could bring ruin upon the kingdom. As Re's fiery orb sinks slowly toward the western horizon, the pharaoh retires to his private quarters for a few snatched moments of relaxation before the evening banquet. Dancing girls sway sinuously to the strains of harps and lyres, while the king sips date wine from a golden goblet and contemplates the finer points of theology with his advisors. But even in repose the specter of death and eternity are never far from his mind, for the pharaoh knows that this mortal life, however opulent and godlike, is but a fleeting dream compared to the glorious forever that awaits him in the field of reeds. It's why he's already poured untold resources into his tomb in the Valley of the Kings, a hidden city of the dead where he will reign in splendor for all eternity. But first he must navigate the tangled web of obligations and dangers that come with wearing the double crown, and nowhere are those perils more present than in his own royal household. From the day he ascends the throne, one of the pharaoh's most pressing duties is to secure the succession by producing a male heir. But in the incestuous hothouse of the royal family, where pharaohs routinely wed their siblings and even their own children to keep the bloodline pure, the battle for power and influence is always seething just beneath the gilded surface. The king's great royal wife may be his half-sister, but that doesn't stop her from plotting with priests and courtiers to advance her own son's claim to the throne over that of his older half-brother. Indeed, the annals of Egyptian history are littered with tales of palace intrigue, rival queens, and ruthless power plays between potential heirs. Take the remarkable story of Hatshepsut, the female pharaoh who ruled as king in her own right for over 20 years in the 15th century BCE. Though she was originally just a regent for her young stepson Thutmose III, Hatshepsut slowly consolidated power, adopting all the masculine trappings of kingship and even depicting herself with a beard in official artwork. Or consider the shocking tale of the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten, who upended centuries of religious tradition by proclaiming the sun disk Atenin as the one true god and outlawing the worship of all others. In his religious zeal, Akhenaten even changed his name from Amenhotep IV to reflect his devotion to Aten, moved the capital to a remote desert city, and persecuted the powerful priests of Amen. His reign was plagued by palace conspiracies and ended in disaster, with his young son Tutankhamun left to pick up the pieces. But perhaps the most disturbing example of how the pharaoh's godlike power could be abused is the practice of human sacrifice that was once disturbingly common in ancient Egypt. Archaeologists have unearthed numerous so-called retainer sacrifices in the tombs of early kings like J and Jet, where dozens of servants were slaughtered to continue serving their master in the afterlife. Even more chillingly, some pharaohs like Ahar were buried with their pets and worldly treasures, as well as piles of human hair wigs likely shorn from sacrificial victims. Thankfully, this ghastly practice seems to have died out by the end of the Old Kingdom, as the Egyptians developed more symbolic ways for pharaohs to take their earthly entourage with them into the afterlife. But it remains a dark stain on the otherwise glittering legacy of the pharaohs, a reminder of the unfathomable gulf that separated these divine kings from the teeming masses they ruled over. As the centuries roll on, the pharaohs continue to shape the course of Egyptian history and leave their mark in stone and story. Some, like Ramses II, known as Ramses the Great, presided over the kingdom at the height of its power and splendor, the triumphs and love lives immortalized on the walls of the temples they built to their own glory. Others, like the fabled Cleopatra Ieth, became entangled in the high-stakes intrigues of the wider Mediterranean world, their personal charisma and political savvy the stuff of enduring legend. But perhaps no pharaoh has captured the modern imagination quite like the boy king Tutankhamun, whose lavish tomb discovery in 1922 set off a global wave of tortilla and turned the once obscure ruler into a household name. The dazzling treasures found in Tut's tomb, from his iconic golden death mask to the nested coffins and thrones, provided an unprecedented glimpse into the opulence and artistry of a royal burial and cemented the pharaoh's reputation as the ultimate status symbols of the ancient world. Today, new archaeological discoveries and cutting-edge scientific techniques are allowing us to peer even deeper into the lives and deaths of these endlessly fascinating rulers. CT scans and DNA analysis have revealed the inbred genetic deformities that plagued Tut's family line, as well as the festering wounds and malaria that likely claimed his life at the tender age of 19th. Inscriptions and papyri paint an Increasingly vivid picture of the cutthroat world of palace politics where foreign concubines and scheming viziers jostled for influence in the shadow of the throne, and yet for all the dark secrets and unsettling practices we've uncovered about the pharaohs, their luminous legacy as some of the most iconic and enduring rulers in human history remains UND. For over 3,000 years they presided over a civilization of remarkable achievements and innovations, from the mathematical precision of the pyramids to the medical know-how of the world's first brain surgery. They inspired some of the most sublime and enduring works of art and architecture ever created, from the serene beauty of Nefertiti's limestone bust to the colossal majesty of the colossi of Menon, and they continue to fire our imaginations and tug at our sense of wonder, inviting us to contemplate the mysteries of absolute power and ponder what it means to reach for immortality in the face of the fleeting nature of human life. So the next time you find yourself gazing up at the inscrutable face of the Sphinx or marveling at the golden splendor of Tutankhamun's ceremony mask, take a moment to reflect on the pharaohs who once wielded godlike power over the lives of millions. Theirs is a story of dazzling triumphs and shocking abuses, soaring monuments and chilling body counts unimaginable, wealth and existential dread in the face of eternity. It's a story that reminds us of the heights of human achievement and the depths of our capacity for cruelty, the unquenchable thirst for immortality, and the inescapable reality of death. And it's a story that will continue to captivate us as long as the timeless stones of ancient Egypt keep their secrets close, inviting each new generation to unravel anew the endlessly fascinating riddle of the pharaohs. And with that, we've reached the end of our whirlwind tour through the disturbing and dazzling lives of ancient Egyptian pharaohs. I hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most iconic and influential civilizations, and that the stories of these larger-than-life rulers have provided some rich food for thought as you drift off to sleep. As always, thanks so much for tuning in to Boring History and for spending a portion of your day exploring the endlessly fascinating nooks and crannies of our shared human story. If you've enjoyed this immersive journey into the distant past, I'd be thrilled if you could hit that subscribe button and leave a comment sharing your thoughts on the pharaohs and their far-reaching legacy. Until next time, sweet dreams, and may your reveries be filled with the golden light of the eternal sundisk, the lush reeds of the field of reeds, and the whispered secrets of the kings and queens who once ruled as living gods over the shimmering sands of ancient Egypt. Good night. As we've seen, the pharaohs of ancient Egypt lived lives of opulence and grandeur almost unimaginable today, but behind the glittering facade of gold and gods lay a darker reality, one of unchecked power, mystical obsessions, and the ever-present specter of death. Perhaps no pharaoh embodied these contradictions more than Ramses II, also known as Ramses the Great, ascending to the throne around 1279 BC. Ramses would rule for an astonishing 66 years, one of the longest reigns in Egyptian history. He presided over an era of great prosperity and embarked on a massive building campaign, erecting temples, obelisks, and statues across the empire. The sheer scale and grandeur of these monuments were meant to awe his subjects and proclaim his divine power for all eternity. But Ramses II's thirst for glory and immortality knew no bounds. He fathered over 100 children with a vast harem of wives and concubines. He didn't hesitate to deface or outright destroy the temples and monuments of previous rulers, replacing their names and images with his own in a brazen act of propaganda. Even the colossal statues he erected of himself, some towering over 80 foot tall, were exercises in deified narcissism and self-arrandisement. Yet perhaps most disturbing were the measures Ramses took to ensure his own afterlife. His sprawling tomb complex, the Ramesseum, included a massive Iri temple served by an entire city of priests, artisans, and slaves. Ramses spared no expense furnishing his eternal resting place, packing it with unimaginable treasures, golden chariots, exquisite furniture, intricately carved alabaster vessels. Even his beloved pet lion was mummified to accompany him. But Ramses didn't stop there. Recent excavations suggest that many of the pharaoh's household staff, including his concubines, were ritually sacrificed upon his death so they could continue serving him in the afterlife. The remains of these victims paint a grim picture, their bodies posed as if still waiting hand and foot on their master, now an eternally divine king. It's a chilling reminder of just how far ancient Egyptian rulers were willing to go in their quest for immortality and godlike power. Ramses II may have reigned over a golden age, but he also exploited untold thousands in service of his own vanity and delusions of divinity. The blood and sweat of commoners quite literally built his legacy. While Ramses the Great was a particularly egregious example, he was far from the only pharaoh to abuse his absolute power in such ways. His predecessors Amenhotep III and Akhenaten undertook similarly ambitious and self-serving building projects. The boy king Tutankhamun was entombed with a staggering array of priceless treasures, while Cleopatra ruthlessly eliminated her own siblings to secure sole control of the throne. Time and again, the pharaohs proved that their deified status placed them above the moral laws governing ordinary Egyptians. They could upend religious traditions on a whim, take countless sexual partners, seize property and labor, even ritualize murder, all without consequence. The promise of a glorious afterlife made megalomaniacal excess not only acceptable but almost inevitable. But in the end, the pharaohs discovered what all tyrants must, that no mortal, no matter how powerful, can escape death. For all their temples and tombs, magical spells, and sacrificial servants, they succumbed to the same fate as the humblest peasant. Their mummified bodies and worldly possessions gathered dust in the darkness while their empire declined and their gods were forgotten. The cautionary tale of the pharaohs still resonates in our modern world of would be strong men and self-styled demigods. Those who believe themselves above the common bonds of morality and mortality would do well to remember how the mightiest rulers of ancient Egypt met their ignominious ends. For the great leveler comes for kings and commoners alike, a humbling lesson 3,000 years in the making. As we close this chapter on the disturbing lives of ancient Egypt's god-kings, one can't help but marvel at all that's been lost to the devouring sands of time. We may have unearthed their treasures and unraveled some of their secrets, but so much remains unknown about this captivating civilization that built wonders and banished moral constraints. Perhaps as archaeologists chip away at the layers of history, we'll come to an even clearer understanding of the shadows behind the pharaoh's dazzling reign, a deeper knowledge of what drove these divine rulers to such heights of power and depths of depraved self-obsession. Until then, they'll continue to haunt our imagination, spectacular sphinx-like, cloaked in gold and mystery. We can only guess at what other chilling revelations lie buried in the Valley of the Kings, waiting to see the light of day. Once more, tales of tyrants and god-kings faded to dust and etched in eternity, a reminder that even the grandest of empires and most glorified of rulers can't escape time's inexorable march. So as we drift off to sleep, our heads filled with gilded sarcophagi and whispering spirits, let's ponder the enduring allure of these ancient royals who held the power of life and death, heaven and earth, in their manicured hands, and be thankful perhaps that their like will never walk among us again, divine, decadent, and undone by their own towering egos. The next morning would see the pharaoh embark on his daily routine of religious duties and governing. He would first bathe in a sacred pool or be cleansed with holy water by priests, a ritual believed to purify both body and spirit. The pharaoh was then dressed in the finest linens, adorned with regal symbols like the double crown, scepter, and crook, each item held deep meaning, the crook representing his role as shepherd of his people, the flail his authority to punish enemies of Egypt. But even these mundane morning tasks were imbued with layers of spiritual significance. Every movement was like a carefully choreographed dance governed by the strict rules of Mahat, the cosmic order that held the universe together. To deviate even slightly from these divine protocols was to court chaos and risk the gods' wrath. It was a heavy existential burden to bear, but one seen as absolutely essential for a living god. Once attired in his divine regalia, the pharaoh would emerge from the palace to begin his pact schedule. Often first up was a visit to the temple to make offerings to the gods and perform vital rituals, as the high priest of every temple is role was to gratify the gods and secure their continued blessings for Egypt. He would deliver offerings, recite sacred spells, and burn incense to the cult statues in the temple sanctuary. No matter how tedious each rite had to be performed with perfect precision, like maintaining a cosmic engine. Even the subtlest mistake could have catastrophic consequences. The famous pyramid texts carved on the walls of royal tombs were essentially a script for the pharaoh to follow in the afterlife, guiding him through the trials to reach the blessed field of reeds. One can only imagine the intense pressure and anxiety of having to execute the rituals flawlessly with the highest stakes imaginable riding on them. With his religious duties complete, the pharaoh would turn to the business of governing Egypt. He would meet with his most trusted advisors who acted as his eyes and ears throughout the land. They delivered reports on the political situation in Egypt and its diplomatic ties with rivals like the Nubians, Hittites, and Mesopotamians. The pharaoh would hear petitions from his people and pronounce his judgments according to Mahat. Although the viziers oversaw the vast state bureaucracy on a day-to-day basis, the pharaoh had the final say on all matters and was expected to uphold justice. Governing a massive state was challenging enough, but the pharaoh's Absolute power created its own disturbing incentives with no real check on his whims. A pharaoh could easily succumb to corruption or tyranny if he wished. Some pharaohs imposed brutal taxes and forced labor on their subjects to build their own lavish monuments. Others grew paranoid and resorted to ruthless purges of anyone they perceived as a threat. The atomic pharaoh Toi IV had his own mother and brother murdered to eliminate potential rivals to the throne. With ultimate power over life and death, even the bonds of family could turn deadly. But the pharaoh's day wasn't all blood and toil. He was also entitled to enjoy the finest earthly pleasures and leisure pursuits. He might go on a hunting expedition in the desert, firing arrows from his war chariot at fleeing lions and gazelles. The hunt was seen as a metaphor for the pharaoh's triumph over the forces of chaos that constantly threatened Egypt. A successful hunt proved his vitality and warrior prowess. The pharaoh might also indulge in a board game of Senate with one of his trusted courtiers. Senate was hugely popular among the Egyptian elite, and even took on spiritual dimensions. Some believed the game mimicked the soul's journey through the Duat underworld, with the final squares representing the gates of the afterlife. Here again, the lines between earthly recreation and cosmic symbolism were always blurred as Re's journey across the sky drew to a close and shadows lengthened. The pharaoh would finally retire to his chambers after a long day of service to the two lands, but even in rest his divine duties never ceased. The pharaoh's sleep was believed to mystically merge his bar soul with the sun god, renewing his divine life force. It was a time of strange visions and communion with the gods, not mere repose. Enigmatic dream books have survived that were used to help interpret the pharaoh's dreams and discern divine messages in them. In one disturbing dream from the Chester Batty Papyrus, the pharaoh Ramses II Drunky saw Peter, the great creator god of Memphis, standing over him with a sword. Peter angrily chastised him for not completing his temple and struck him on his side. When Ramses awoke, he was determined to appease the wrathful deity by expediting work on the temple. Even in his own dreams, it seemed there was no refuge from the crushing pressure of his role. The pharaoh's waking hours may have passed according to strict ritual and protocol, but his sleeping mind was an untamed landscape where deities and demons roamed freely. The same potent magic he wielded by day held sway in this nocturnal realm for good or ill. Spells were carved on headrests and bed frames to protect the vulnerable sleeper from malign forces. This liminal space between waking and dreaming was a potent time for communing with the unseen and for divining the gods' muriel wills. The life of a pharaoh from sun up to sundown was a tightrope walk between the earthly and divine, the banal and sublime. Every action, no matter how routine, took on transcendent significance in a world pulsing with magic and portent. There could be no real distinction between sacred and profane. That pervasive aura of mysticism and symbolism infused the pharaoh's day-to-day existence, but also justified the absolute power he wielded by upholding Mahat in the material realm. The pharaoh sustained the proper order that kept the cosmos from dissolving into oblivion, but that same power also enabled the darkest impulses and excesses of human nature. The challenge for any pharaoh was to embody the lofty virtues of a god on earth while still being fallible flesh and blood. Some managed that balancing act with justice and restraint, securing their people's prosperity and history's favor. Others succumbed to tyranny and caprice, leaving legacies forever tainted by cruelty. But whether revered or reviled, the pharaohs all shared an existence profoundly alien to our modern sensibilities, where the scope of one's actions held literally life and death stakes for an entire civilization. The pharaoh's day typically began at sunrise with a ceremonial cleansing by priests, followed by a grand procession out to the main temple for ritual offerings and worship as a living god. This direct link to the divine was the pharaoh's most vital duty necessary to maintain Marat. He would present statuettes of himself as offerings and libate wine, milk, and other precious liquids before the gods. Incense would be burned, prayers recited, and sacred magic enacted through liturgies and hymns. After the morning rituals, the pharaoh would attend to the business of state, receiving ministers' reports, settling legal cases, and issuing decrees on everything from irrigation projects to mining expeditions. He would also engage in more ceremonial duties as the day progressed, from officiating over agricultural festivals to commissioning monumental building works in his name. The pharaoh's workday was interspersed with breaks for meals, recreation, and rest. Meals were sumptuous affairs, with the pharaoh entitled to the choicest cuts of meat, the freshest produce from palace gardens, and delicacies like honey, figs, and dates. Servants would swat flies with long fans and offer water to wash. Recreation might include hunting, board games like Senate, or watching performances by musicians, dancers, and Acrobats. Some pharaohs enjoyed swimming in palace pools or taking a langangerous barge ride down the Nile, but even in leisure there was little respite from ritual and responsibility if the pharaoh opted for a pleasure cruise. It would be aboard a gilded barge hung with fluttering pennants, rowed by crews of servants as he relaxed under a canopy with his family and courtiers. If he retired to his harem for the evening, he was still expected to spend time with his great royal wife and produce heirs to secure the dynasty. The god king's life was a goldfish bowl of relentless public scrutiny and expectation. While the pharaoh's magnificent surroundings and godlike status may seem enviable, it was in truth an intensely demanding and precarious existence. The smallest lapse in upholding morat, whether ritual or moral, could unleash the furies of fate upon the entire land. He was like an acrobat crossing the Nile on a gossamer thread poised between the earthly and the eternal. The burden of his office was an exhausting marathon of pageantry and weighty decisions with the highest possible stakes in play. As the pharaoh finally retired for the evening, borne aloft on a gilded palanquin to his royal bedchamber, the day's exertions would take their toll. Falling into a dreamless sleep, he could at last slip the yoke of ritual and protocol. However briefly, in the morning the great wheel would turn once more and the demigod would re-emerge to greet the rising sun. But in those darkest hours before dawn, the pharaoh's chamber was a hushed sanctum of shadows and murmuring breaths of stillness and quiet. Herein night's forgiving embrace, he was merely human once more. Royal relationships and rivalries. The ancient Egyptian royal court was a hothouse of political intrigue, power plays, and Machiavellian machinations. At its apex was the pharaoh himself, the nucleus around which courtiers, officials, priests, and supplicants all revolved like planets around the sun. But the pharaoh was far from alone in his gilded cage. From incestuous marriages to murderous feuds, the intimate relationships and sting rivalries of the royal household were an eternal wellspring of drama to rival any soap opera. The women who surrounded the pharaoh were some of the most influential and intriguing figures in the palace. Foremost among them was the great royal wife, the queen, who was meant to be the pharaoh's favorite consort and chief partner in ruling Egypt. Many queens wielded substantial power in their own right, with some like Nefertiti and Hatshepsut even eclipsing their husband's authority. Nefertiti, the legendary beauty and great royal wife of the oddball pharaoh Akhenaten, may have reigned as a full-fledged co-ruler beside him during the height of the Amena period's religious upheaval. She vanished mysteriously from the record in Akhenaten's final years, but some tantalizing clues hint that she may have even succeeded him as the shrouded pharaoh. The jury's still out on that enigma. Hatshepsut's unprecedented power play was even more dramatic, as the royal daughter-wife and mother of kings. Hatshepsut was uniquely poised to make her move when her young stepson Thutmose II inherited the throne. First serving as his regent, Hatshepsut soon assumed the full titles and regalia of a king in her own right, dropping the feminine endings from her royal name. For over 2 decades, Egypt had a female pharaoh in all but anatomy, dominating a time of immense prosperity and monumental building. Only after her death did Thutmose III emerge from the shadow of his formidable stepmother. But being the pharaoh's chief wife and queen was no guarantee of an easy life in a polygamous palace. The queen always had to stay on her toes to maintain her influence and guard against rivals. One of the most infamous examples was the bitter war between Ramses II's chief queen Nefertari and the secondary wife Isetnefert, mother of the heir apparent. Court gossip gleefully chronicled how the two powerful women schemed ceaselessly against each other, using everything from lavish banquets to slanderous graffiti to sway the pharaoh's favor. The stakes in this Game of Thrones were immensely high, as queens vied to secure the succession for their own sons. Isnefret ultimately triumphed, living to see her son Manpar take the throne, but only after decades of cutthroat intrigue. Such vicious rivalries between a pharaoh's wives were part for the palace. Coarse incest was another queasy quirk of royal marriages seen as essential to safeguarding the sacred bloodline. Pharaohs often married their sisters' daughters and even mothers in an attempt to keep the royal lineage as pure as possible. The Greek Ptolemaic dynasty took this to extremes, with the family tree nodding back on itself in a snarl tangle of repeated incestuous unions. Cleopatra Ieth, the most famous toy of all, was actually the product of at least 3 generations of uninterrupted brother marriages. Her family seemed to be competing to rack up the most convoluted incestuous relationships with uncle, niece, and even double sibling matches thrown in for good measure. Ironically, all this incestuous inbreeding may have produced the genetic quirks and mental instability that ultimately doomed the dynasty. But incest in the royal family wasn't just an atomic phenomenon, it was an age-old custom dating back to the mythical origins of Egyptian kingship itself. The pharaoh was seen as the earthly embodiment of Horus, the divine son of Osiris, and Isis a brother-sister pair who also happened to be husband and wife by emulating the gods incestuous marriage. The pharaoh was upholding the cosmic order and literally following in the footsteps of the gods. Of course, such sibling marriages must have taken a heavy toll both psychologically and genetically. The famous Tutankhamun was the sickly short-lived product of an incestuous match between Akhenaten and his sister. His congenitally deformed foot and cleft palate point to the deleterious effects of inbreeding, but to the ancient Egyptians purity of blood was far more important than genetic diversity. Incest was therefore not a taboo but a sacred tradition. If rivalries between wives were vicious, those between potential heirs could be downright murderous. Primogeniture was not a hard and fast rule in ancient Egypt, meaning that any son or even daughter of the pharaoh could potentially make a play for the throne. This often led to cutthroat power struggles and grim succession crises as rival princes schemed to eliminate their competitors. One notorious example was Amenet, the founder of the powerful 12th dynasty and advisor to the previous king. Amenet launched a successful coup and had himself crowned as the new pharaoh, but his reign was plagued by constant conspiracies and assassination attempts as rival factions jockeyed for power. His own harem even launched a shadowy plot against his life, creeping into the royal bedchamber with daggers drawn. Amenhotep only survived by the intervention of his loyal guards, fighting them off nearly naked. So shaken was Amenhotep by his brush with death that he took the unprecedented step of crowning his son Sinis as co-pharaoh during his own lifetime. By securing the succession early, Amenhotep aimed to stave off further intrigues and smooth the transfer of power. Realpolitik trumped tradition. Amenhotep's instructions to his son, a treatise on effective kingship, reflect his embattled cynicism. Be on your guard against all subordinates because you cannot be sure who is plotting against you. Perhaps the ultimate example of a royal rivalry turned deadly was the grim fall of Ramses III, the last great pharaoh of the New Kingdom. Court records paint a sordid picture of a geriatric pharaoh with a harem of hundreds riven by factionalism as rival wives schemed to put their sons on the throne. One wife, Tyr, hatched an audacious plot to assassinate Ramses and crown her son Pentuer in a coup. The conspiracy was uncovered at the 11th hour, but not before a bloody skirmish between guards loyal to Ty and those protecting the pharaoh. In the end, Ramses' own throat was slit, likely by an assassin who wormed his way into the royal harem. The king lingered just long enough to appoint his designated heir and round up the leaders of the failed coup. In a grisly epilogue, the chief conspirators were forced to commit suicide while the hapless Pentuer was brutally executed and denied proper burial. Even in death, royal rivalries refused to rest. Such ruthless intrigues and lethal power plays were all too common in the pharaoh's court, where the knives were perpetually out. Trust and loyalty were luxuries few could afford, with even family members potential enemies vying for position. Caught in this tangled web of shaky alliances and seething resentments, the pharaoh had to walk a razor's edge, vigilantly balancing factions while watching his own back. Heavy was the head that wore the double crown. Gods on earth, the pharaoh as divine ruler more than mere monarchs. The pharaohs of ancient Egypt were living deities straddling the boundary between the earthly and divine. Each pharaoh was seen as the embodiment of Horus, the falcon-headed sky god, and the son of the great sun god Re. As the practice of retainer sacrifice, also known as retainer burial, was one of the most chilling customs in ancient Egypt. The idea was that servants, both human and animal, who attended the pharaoh in life would continue to serve him in death and the afterlife. This was seen as an honor to accompany one's king for eternity, but to our modern sensibilities it's a staggering loss of life in the name of royal luxuries. Some of the earliest evidence of retainer sacrifice comes from subsidiary graves around the royal tombs of the first dynasty pharaohs at Abydos. These subsidiary graves contain the remains of servants as well as food, furniture, jewelry, and tools, all the things deemed necessary to serve the pharaoh in the afterlife. The tomb of King Jer is a striking example. Excavations revealed 318 subsidiary burials around his tomb, with servants' bodies arranged in neat rows believed to have been sacrificed upon J's death. Even more unsettling are the animal sacrifices found in pharaonic tombs. Many kings were buried with their beloved pets to keep them company: hunting dogs, cats, monkeys, gazelles, and more. But some animal graves are on a whole different scale. The tomb of King Horahar contained 10 donkeys that had carried his funeral gifts. King Nama's tomb held 10 dogs. The first dynasty pharaoh Waj was even buried with no less than 12 baboons, creatures considered sacred to the god Thoth. But perhaps the most bizarre burial good of all was human hair. Lots and lots of it. Archaeologists uncovered a staggering 30 million animal mummies and 80 tons of human hair in a series of vast catacombs beneath the temple of Anubis at Saqqara. Much of this hair is believed to have been shorn from servants and offered to the jackal-headed god of embalming as a plea for the deceased pharaoh's safe journey to the afterlife. As staggering as these numbers are, it's important to note that human sacrifice was not constant throughout ancient Egyptian history. It seems to have been practiced only in the early dynastic period, phasing out as mummification and more symbolic burial goods took precedence. By the time of the New Kingdom, human sacrifices had disappeared, replaced by Shapti figurines meant to magically come alive and act as servants in the afterlife. Still, those early royal tombs with their grim galleries of subsidiary burials leave a lasting and haunting impression. They speak to the absolute power of the pharaohs and the value placed on their post-mortem comfort. Above all else, even in death, the pharaohs commanded the living. Their sacred status meant their journey to the afterlife was all that mattered, no matter how many had to die to ensure it. This is perhaps best summed up by the inscription on the tomb of the 6th dynasty courtier Vinay the Elder. He proudly describes his role in building the royal tomb, saying, "His Majesty sent me to Et to bring the sarcophagus with its lid and the costly august pyramidion, for the pyramid called Menura shines and is beautiful of the queen eye. Did it all in the completeness and exactness which His Majesty loves." The pharaoh's eternal resting place was paramount, sparing no expense, effort, or life. But not all pharaohs clung to these dark sacrificial practices. The reign of Akhenaten, the controversial king who upended Egyptian religion by worshipping only the sun, disenabled for its lack of evidence of human sacrifice. Akhenaten moved the capital to a new city, Akhenaten, known today as Amana. Here he built a royal tomb with no subsidiary graves, perhaps signaling a shift in honorary customs to match his religious reforms. However, Akhenaten's changes were short-lived. After his death, his son Tutankhamun and successors returned to the old gods and traditional practices. Tut's own famous tomb, discovered in 1922, was stocked with all the traditional grave goods and mummified remains of his several stillborn daughters. Though not sacrificed in the old way, these children still accompanied him to the afterlife as eternal reminders of his divine blood. And so, even as human sacrifice waned, the pharaonic obsession with the afterlife never did. The mummification process grew ever more elaborate, with pharaohs like Seti the Firm and Ramses II going to their eternal rest in multi-room hidden tombs filled with every earthly treasure. They were still meant to live forever as gods among the gods, even if their retinue of ghostly servants was now rendered in wood, clay, and stone rather than flesh and blood. This enduring belief in the pharaoh's divinity and earthly eternity attained is perhaps their most lasting legacy. Long after their tombs were looted and bodies scattered, the pharaohs are still with us, resurrected in our history books and museum galleries. We still speak their names: Khufu, Nefertiti, Hatshepsut, Tutankhamun, and marvel at their monuments they built for eternity. And in many ways they achieved it, though not as they might have imagined, for the pharaoh's eternal life was given a birthright of their divine status for their subjects. The afterlife had to be earned through service both in this life and the next. This fundamental divide, the chasm between the god-kings and the rest of humanity, is what makes their world at once so dazzling and so alien to our eyes. It was a world where one person by accident of birth could command the living and the dead, move mountains and rivers, and shape the very landscape of eternity. That was the power and the burden of the pharaohs, the sons of ancient Egypt, who lived, ruled, and died as gods on earth. And yet, for all their power and splendor, the pharaohs were still mortal men and women. They suffered from the same human frailties: disease, injury, family drama, political intrigue. They just did so on a much grander scale, befitting their exalted status. This is perhaps what makes them so endlessly fascinating, so ripe for continual study and speculation. They were larger than life, but still life-sized, untouchable gods, but still flesh and blood in the end. Maybe this is what draws us back again and again to the lives of the pharaohs. They built the pyramids and great sphinx, grand temples and hidden tombs, but they also loved their children, mourned their dead, and hoped for eternity. They were both extraordinarily powerful and extraordinarily human, and that more than any monument or mummy is their most enduring legacy, the reminder that even the most exalted among us are still one of us. Even a pharaoh beneath the crowns and finery, the incense smoke and chanting priests, was still a person making their way in the world, looking ahead to the next. The ancient Egyptians believed that to speak the name of the dead was to make them live again. Perhaps then we are all part of the pharaoh's afterlife. Every time we tell their stories, ponder their lives, and marvel at their works, they built their tombs and pyramids to last till the end of time and in doing so they built themselves into the very bedrock of our history. The pharaohs may be gone, but they are not forgotten. They live on in our collective memory, as real and vivid as the paint on their tomb walls, and so we keep them in their extraordinary, disturbing, dazzling world now and for all eternity, and so we lay the pharaohs to rest as they were laid to rest so long ago, with reverence, with wonder, and with the whisper of their names echoing down through the ages. Sleep well, god kings and queens of the now. May your car endure, your bar take flight, and your stories be told for all time. And thank you, dear listener, for accompanying us on this journey into the distant past. May the peace of the pharaohs be with you, and may your dreams be as sweet as the lotus blossoms on the Nile. Good night. The immense power and influence wielded by the ancient Egyptian pharaohs is truly mind-boggling to contemplate even thousands of years later. As both divine figures and absolute monarchs, these god-kings lived lives of luxury and excess that would be unimaginable to the average person. But hand in hand with their privileged status came a darker side, one full of deadly intrigues, power-hungry machinations, and disturbing practices that revealed the heavy burden and often twisted realities of sitting on the throne of Egypt. It was a gilded cage in many ways. Take, for example, the pharaoh's daily routine. While it may have been filled with the finest food, servants attending to every whim, and leisurely pursuits like hunting, boating, and board games, it was also rigidly prescribed by religious duties and superstitious rituals. Every aspect was governed by a desire to maintain the proper order of the universe, so a pharaoh couldn't simply wake up and do as he pleased. There were temple rites to perform, offerings to make, and a pantheon of gods to appease. The Egyptians believed that the pharaoh had to carry out these rituals in order for the cycles of nature, like the life-giving Nile floods, to continue. That's a heavy responsibility to bear. Even the pharaoh's personal grooming was laden with meaning, washing in sacred water from the Nile, shaving their heads, and donning copious amounts of perfume, makeup, and jewelry wasn't just about vanity. It was a way of setting themselves apart, of embodying the divine on earth, and it didn't stop at appearances. Practically every minute of a pharaoh's day was scheduled and accounted for, from petitions and offerings in the morning to touring building projects and consulting with advisors in the afternoon. Even their moments of rest and leisure in the evening were shaped by tradition and the need to be seen as more than human. The pressure to live up to this superhuman ideal must have been immense, and it bred more than a few pharaohs who, drunk on power and self-arrangement, took things to dark and disturbing extremes in their quest to be the supreme ruler on both earth and in the afterlife. You can see this most clearly perhaps in the kind of megalomaniac building projects that pharaohs undertook. Not content with your average tomb or memorial temple, some commanded their subjects to toil for decades on massive, glorious monuments to themselves. The Great Pyramid of Giza, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, is a perfect example. This was commissioned by the pharaoh Khufu around 2550 BC, standing over 480 foot tall and comprised of over 2 million limestone blocks. It was the tallest man-made structure in the world for almost 4,000 years. The logistics and labor that went into building Khufu's pyramid are staggering to contemplate. Stones weighing an average of over 2 tons had to be quarried, transported, and assembled with absolute precision using only primitive copper chisels, bronze saws, wooden rollers, and sleds, ramps, levers, and pulleys. Experts estimate it took over 20,000 workers and as long as 27 years to complete, and for what all to house the corpse of one man and ensure his safe passage to the afterlife. It's an astounding, and some would say appalling, display of power and self-arrangement, not to mention that life was incredibly harsh for the armies of workers who built pyramids like Khufu's. They may not have been slaves, as popular law often suggests, but the backbreaking work took a serious toll. Scans of skeletal remains from the workers' cemeteries show high rates of arthritis injuries and stress. Pyramid building eventually fell out of favor, perhaps becoming too costly and time-consuming even for the pharaohs, but the rich and powerful still found other ways to flaunt their wealth in the face of death. Take King Tuten, the famed boy king who ruled in the 14th century BC. While he died young and had a relatively short reign, his golden death mask and opulent grave goods have become enduring symbols of ancient Egypt's wealth and splendor. When Howard Carter unsealed King Tut's small tomb in 1922, he found room after room stuffed to the brim with a dazzling array of over 5,000 priceless objects: golden shrines, jewel-encrusted chests, intricately carved furniture, chariots, clothes, perfumes, and even food and wine to sustain Tut in the afterlife. The sensational discovery ignited a wave of Tut mania around the world and introduced millions to the glories of ancient Egypt, but it also highlights the phenomenal excess enjoyed by the pharaohs, even the minor ones like Tutankhamun. Some rulers took it even further, burying loyal subjects with them to serve them in death as they had in life. This is a practice known as Retainer sacrifice and evidence for it has been found in some of the earliest royal tombs going back to the First Dynasty around 3000 BC in tombs at the royal burial ground of Abydos. Archaeologists discovered the remains of court officials, servants, and even dogs arrayed around the pharaoh's sarcophagus and subsidiary graves. It seems these unlucky attendants were sacrificed to continue their duties in the afterlife, a disturbing reflection of how much the pharaoh's power extended beyond the grave. Thankfully, this practice seems to have largely died out by the Old Kingdom period, but the fact that it was ever condoned at all is a chilling reminder of the absolute godlike power ancient Egyptians invested in their kings, even as mummification techniques became more and more refined and the fabled Valley of the Kings filled with hidden tombs. The gulf between the pharaoh's eternal comfort and the lot of the average Egyptian couldn't have been starker. While the royals enjoyed gold, jewels, and linen wrappings in the afterlife, most people had to make do with a simple pit grave and a few humble trinkets. If that the inequality was so stark, it's little wonder that tomb-robbing became a constant scourge for Egyptian elites. Still, the promise of eternal life, however luxurious, was one that even the pharaohs couldn't always count on, as the fates of some of the most famous rulers attest. Take Ramses II, widely regarded as the greatest and most powerful pharaoh of the New Kingdom. His reign, which lasted an astonishing 66 years from 1279 to 1213 BC, marked the peak of ancient Egypt's imperial power and prosperity. Ramses II, or Ramses the Great as he's often known, was a military leader who expanded Egypt's reach in Nubia, Libya, and the Levant. He was also a prolific builder who erected many grand temples, statues, and monuments, but for all his glory in life, Ramses II didn't exactly get the restful and dignified eternity he probably expected. His mummy has been moved and disturbed countless times over the millennia, as tomb robbers, priests, and archaeologists have all had a hand in its fate. When Ramses' mummy was finally unwrapped in 1886 by Gaston Maspero, the head of the Egyptian Antiquities Service, it was found to be in poor condition. The king's body was broken into pieces, many bones were missing, and a gaping hole in the skull suggested the work of ancient Ludder. Still, with his long aquiline nose, strong jaw, and shock of white hair, Ramses was an imposing figure even in death. His mummy is now on display at the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization in Cairo, a far cry from his original resting place in the Valley of the Kings, but no less a potent symbol of his enduring power and mystique. In the end, perhaps it's this very mystique, this mix of the marvelous and the macabre, the inspiring and the unsettling, that keeps us so fascinated by the pharaohs of ancient Egypt. They were larger-than-life figures who wielded immense power and wealth, but they were also mortal men subject to the same fears, foibles, and fates as the rest of us. Peering into their lives, their triumphs and excesses, their vanities and vulnerabilities, is like holding up a mirror to the human condition. We see the heights to which we can ascend and the depths to which we can sink. We marvel at the ingenuity and artistry of an ancient civilization, even as we recoil at some of its more disturbing practices. Most of all, we come face to face with the stark realities of power, its seductions and its pitfalls, its uses and its abuses. The pharaohs may have ruled as gods on earth, but they were also prisoners of a system that demanded constant displays of strength, piety, and conspicuous consumption. In that sense, perhaps we can even feel a twinge of sympathy for these divine rulers trapped in their gilded cages, burdened with the weight of an entire civilization's hopes, dreams, and fears. It's a far cry from the glamorous and carefree existence we might imagine for a god-king, but then again, that's the enduring allure of ancient Egypt. It defies our expectations and challenges our assumptions at every turn. It is a civilization that was at once familiar and alien, majestic and monstrous, enlightened and benignant, and the pharaohs, for all their flaws and foibles, were the avatars of this endlessly fascinating world. They may have lived and died thousands of years ago, but their stories, their secrets, and their splendors continue to haunt us to this day. We will likely never fully unravel all the mysteries of the pharaohs and their world, but that doesn't stop us from trying, from poring over every scrap of papyrus, studying every mummy and monument, sifting through every grain of desert sand for clues to their lives and times. In a way, that's the greatest legacy of the pharaohs, not the pyramids or the golden treasures, but the enduring sense of wonder and curiosity they inspire in us, the tantalizing glimpse they offer into a world at once vanished and vivid, lost and everlasting. So perhaps the real question is not what we can learn from the pharaohs, but what we can learn about ourselves in our endless fascination with them. What does our obsession with these ancient rulers say about our own hopes, dreams, and fears? What does it reveal about our relationship to power, to death, to the eternal mysteries of the human heart? These are questions that may never have definitive answers, But they are worth pondering nonetheless, just as the pharaohs themselves continue to beguile and bewilder us, inviting us to explore ever deeper the labyrinthine recesses of their world and our own. And so the story of the pharaohs endures as it has for millennia, a tale of power and pause, of glory and despair, of the eternal dance between light and shadow that defines the human condition. It is a story that will continue to be told and retold as long as there are those who seek to peer behind the veil of history and glimpse the faces of those who once ruled as gods among men. The pharaoh would begin his morning ablutions in an ornate limestone washroom where a small army of servants waited to assist their living god. First they would delicately wrap him in fine linen towels and escort him to a gleaming copper bathing tub filled with water lotus flowers floating on the surface. As he stepped in, the servants would carefully wash the pharaoh's body with natron, a mineral salt that cleansed and softened the skin. They paid special attention to his hands and feet, gently scrubbing away any dirt or impurities. After bathing, the pharaoh would be dried off and a servant would appear bearing a tray of fragrant oils. With practiced motions he would anoint the king from head to toe, massaging the oils into his skin until it glowed. These sacred unwashed incense of myrrh, frankincense, and cinnamon were believed to have magical protective properties, shielding the pharaoh from evil spirits and misfortune. A dab of black coal was carefully applied around his eyes, not just for beauty but to deflect the harsh glare of the sun god Ra and ward off eye infections. Next came the pharaoh's iconic regalia, the crown, scepters, and jewels that denoted his supreme status. Every item was imbued with layers of religious and political symbolism. The distinctive double crown, for example, represented the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt under the pharaoh's divine rule. A designated servant would reverentially lift the lapis lazuli and gold headdress and place it atop the king's head, taking great care to arrange it just so. Then would come the crook and flail, implements of kingship, often depicted crossed over the pharaoh's chest. In art and sculpture, the crook symbolized his role as shepherd of his people, while the flail represented his ability to mete out punishment to enemies of the state. Once adorned, the pharaoh would emerge from his chambers to greet the day, a glittering vision, inspiring both reverence and terror. But this was only the beginning of a grueling daily routine that left little room for rest. First on the agenda was worship and offering rituals at the temple, where the pharaoh would honor the gods and elevate his own divine status. At the heart of every Egyptian temple was the inner sanctum, where a statue of the chief god resided. Only the pharaoh and the high priests were allowed to enter this sacred space and perform the daily rites. The king would prostrate himself before the god's image, reciting prayers and burning incense. He would present lavish offerings of food, drink, clothing, and jewelry, symbolically giving the god all the best produce of the land. In return, the deity would bestow divine favor and protection on Egypt and empower the pharaoh to rule wisely and defeat his enemies. This sacred transaction between the king and the gods was the bedrock of Egyptian cosmic order, but it was also a daily reinforcement of the pharaoh's precarious position. His people believed his piety and right conduct literally sustained the cycles of the sun, the Nile floods, and the agricultural bounty of the kingdom. It was a heavy responsibility to shoulder day in and day out. With his religious duties complete, the pharaoh would begin the real work of governing, a task he largely delegated to his most trusted advisors. The pharaoh's prime minister, known as the vizier, oversaw the sprawling administrative apparatus that kept the kingdom running smoothly. A huge bureaucracy of scribes, tax collectors, and local officials managed everything from recording the Nile flood levels and grain harvests to dispensing justice in the courts. But the pharaoh was expected to take an active role in decision-making on key issues like diplomacy, trade, and monumental building projects. He would consult with his advisors in an audience chamber, seated on a golden throne flanked by statues of the falcon god Horus and the cobra goddess Wadjet. Painted on the walls around him were scenes of the pharaoh smiting foreign enemies and offering to the gods potent reminders of his larger-than-life duties. Seated at his feet on Attis would be his great royal wife, the queen, who bore the next heir to the throne. The vizier and other courtiers would bow low before the royal couple, hands raised in supplication, awaiting their orders. Messengers and petitioners would be ushered in to deliver reports on the state of the kingdom or beg boons from the pharaoh. There might be disturbing news of a military skirmish at the border requiring the king to marshal his armies, or a request to send aid to a region facing drought and famine. Diplomats from foreign lands would present tribute and tokens of respect in exchange for trade, concessions, and treaties. The pharaoh would hear each matter in turn, consulting with his advisors and rendering judgments with an authority that could not be questioned. Even in his leisure time, the king was performing his royal role. He would go On ceremonial hunting expeditions in the desert, firing arrows at lions and other big game from a speeding chariot, this was a demonstration of his physical prowess and mastery over the wild forces of nature. Important propaganda in a world where might made right. He would also preside over jubilant religious festivals like the Opet festival, celebrating the link between the pharaoh and the great god Amun-Ra. In a spectacular river procession, the pharaoh would accompany statues of Thean triad of gods on a barge sailing down the Nile as huge crowds thronged the banks to cheer them on. At the end of a long day, the pharaoh would retire to his private quarters where he might indulge in more earthly pleasures. Many kings kept harems of secondary wives and concubines in addition to their great royal wife. These women lived in a separate palace area visited by the pharaoh whenever he desired. Some pharaohs like Amenhotep III and Ramses II had over 100 children from multiple wives, an extensive royal brood seen as a sign of the king's virility and divine favor. But even in these intimate moments there was no escaping the religious and ritual significance woven through every aspect of the pharaoh's life. Having intercourse with his wives wasn't just a sexual act, it was a sacred rite reenacting the creation of the cosmos by the gods. The pharaoh was expected to perform in the bedroom just as he did on the throne and the battlefield, and the women who shared his bed, while pampered and privileged, also faced intense pressure to produce royal heirs, preferably sons. The stakes were high in a world where the succession of divine kingship was paramount. As the pharaoh drifted off to sleep, no doubt exhausted by the burdens of his exalted station, he could only hope that his efforts had pleased the gods and kept the forces of chaos at bay for another day. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove his worth as the living embodiment of divine order on earth. It was a relentless cycle, but one that each pharaoh was born and raised to fulfill, no matter the cost. Such was the disturbing life of these god kings who ruled over ancient Egypt for 3,000 years. Of course, even the most revered pharaohs were only human under all the divine trappings, and behind the palace walls royal family drama seethed, often with devastating consequences. Rivalries between a pharaoh's wives were common, as each competed to have her son named heir to the throne. These feuds took on legendary proportions in some cases, like the rivalry between Ramses II's wife Nefertitari and his secondary consortet Nefertitari, whose beauty and influence were so great she was known as the one for whom the sun shines. Had borne Ramses several sons, but none had survived to succeed him. Isitin-Fret saw her chance to install her own son Manpar as crown prince and worked to undermine Nefertitari. At every turn the struggle came to a head when Nefertitari's tomb was vandalized, her image hacked out of the wall reliefs in a blatant attempt to erase her from history and memory. Many suspected Isetnaf was behind the desecration, though nothing could be proven in the end. Despite Nefertitari's unrivaled status, it was Isatnefert's son Mipa who took the throne after Ramses' death. Such was the Game of Thrones played out in the pharaoh's court, where even the most beloved consort could fall victim to the ruthless machinations of her rivals. Even more scandalous were the rare but documented cases of incest within the royal family. The pharaohs believed their divine blood had to be kept pure at all costs, even if that meant marrying their siblings or even their own children. This practice may have reached its disturbing apex with the curious case of Akhenaten, the rebel pharaoh who upended centuries of religious tradition by proclaiming the Sundisk Aten as the one true god. Akhenaten was already a strange and enigmatic figure, depicted in art with an elongated skull, spindly limbs, and feminine hips that have long puzzled scholars. But even more shocking was his unconventional choice of chief wife and queen, his own daughter Ankhemun. Archaeological evidence suggests Ankhemun was born to Akhenaten and his first wife, Nefertiti, when they were both very young. Perhaps as young as 12 years old, she would have grown up in her father's sprawling new capital city of Amanna, a surreal landscape dominated by the towering temples of the Aten Sundisk. As she blossomed into a young woman, Ankhesenamun caught the eye of her father, who by then had proclaimed himself the living incarnation of the Aten and banned the worship of all other gods in a move that must have scandalized the court. Akhenaten took his teenage daughter as his great royal wife, the pharaoh's consort who would rule by his side and bear his children. The union was immortalized in a series of intimate portraits carved into Amanna's limestone cliffs, showing the couple locked in romantic embraces, their bodies intertwined. These scenes, almost pornographic by ancient Egyptian standards, suggest an erotic charge to the relationship that went beyond mere dynastic calculation. What Ankhesenamun herself thought of her fate we can only imagine. As a royal princess, she would have had little say in the matter. The marriage produced at least 2 daughters, but no surviving sons to inherit Akhenaten's throne. When the heretic pharaoh died after a 17-year reign, the Amanna experiment died with him. The old gods were restored, his capital abandoned, and his name erased from the king lists. The young widow Enka vanished from the record, her astonishing story buried until Amanna's ruins were rediscovered in the early 20th century. She has since become an object of fascination and speculation for historians, a symbol of the disturbing lengths to which some pharaohs would go to protect their godly bloodlines. Such was the strange and secretive world of the pharaoh's royal family, a hothouse of intrigue and power struggles played out against the backdrop of divine kingship. The pharaoh may have been worshipped as a god on earth, but he was also a man with all too human appetites and frailties, and those closest to him, the women and children of his household, often paid the highest price for their proximity to power, from incestuous marriages to murderous rivalries. The private lives of the pharaohs were every bit as dramatic and disturbing as their public reigns, but for all the darkness and dysfunction lurking behind palace walls, the pharaohs never lost sight of their ultimate obsession, their own divinity and immortality. From the moment they took the throne, every pharaoh was already planning for the moment they would leave it and ascend to join the gods in the eternal afterlife, and no pharaoh undertook this quest for immortality more assiduously or on a grander scale than the builder of the Great Pyramid of Giza, the legendary Khufu, ruling in the 4th dynasty of the Old Kingdom around 2550 BCE. Khufu was the son of the pharaoh Neferu, who had pioneered pyramid building with his innovative bent and red pyramids, but Khufu was determined to outdo his father and erect a monument that would stand the test of eternity. The result was the Great Pyramid, a towering edifice of 2.3 million limestone blocks rising 481 feet into the desert sky. Even today, it remains the largest single building ever constructed by human hands, a testament to one man's monumental ego and the extraordinary lengths he would go to achieve immortality. The Great Pyramid was more than just a tomb. It was a resurrection machine designed to harness the power of the sun god Ra and the magic of Egyptian engineering to launch Khufu's spirit into the cosmic realms of the gods. Every aspect of its design was suffused with religious symbolism and spells from the pyramid texts, the oldest sacred writings in Egypt. The pyramid's smooth angled sides were clad in polished white limestone that would have made it shine like a giant prism in the desert sun, a radiant beacon guiding Khufu's soul to the heavens. Inside, a series of narrow ascending and descending passages led to the king's burial chamber deep in the heart of the pyramid. This was the most sacred space of all, where Khufu's mummified body would rest in a granite sarcophagus surrounded by all the treasures and supplies he would need for the afterlife. The chamber was a marvel of precision engineering, its walls lined with massive granite blocks fitted so tightly you couldn't slip a piece of paper between them. This was meant to seal the king's body and possessions away from thieves and intruders for all eternity, a secure staging ground for his journey to immortality. But building such a monumental tomb came at a staggering cost, both in resources and human lives. The Great Pyramid required a workforce of skilled masons, engineers, and laborers on a scale never before seen in Egypt. Contrary to popular belief, these were not slaves but paid workers, many of them peasant farmers recruited during the annual Nile flood. When their fields were underwater, they labored in grueling conditions under the desert sun, hauling massive blocks of limestone up ramps and lever systems to construct the pyramid. Layer by meticulous layer, overseeing this vast operation was the pharaoh's cousin Hemiunu, the royal architect who had designed the pyramid and now managed its construction like a military campaign. He commanded an army of overseers and foremen who pushed the workers to their limits, driven by the knowledge that the pharaoh's immortality depended on their speed and precision. Accidents and deaths were an accepted part of the job, with some workers even buried in the shadow of the pyramid. They had died building the human cost of Khufu's ambition was immense, but to the pharaoh it was a price worth paying for eternal life. He saw himself as a divine being, a god incarnate whose spirit would live forever among the stars of the northern sky. The pyramid was his stairway to heaven, a monumental feat of will and engineering that would ensure his name and legacy endured for all time. And in a sense he was right. 4,500 years later we are still marveling at the Great Pyramid and the disturbing lengths to which one pharaoh went to achieve immortality. But even Khufu's audacious monument pales in comparison to the extraordinary measures some of his successors took to equip themselves for the afterlife. As the prosperity and power of the old kingdom waned, later pharaohs became increasingly obsessed with their own mortality and the fate of their eternal souls. They poured their dwindling resources into ever more elaborate tombs and mortuary temples, desperately trying to guarantee their place among the gods. This desperate quest for Immortality reached its macabre apex with the practice of retainer sacrifice, the burial of servants alongside the pharaoh to attend him in the afterlife. The most chilling example comes from the tomb of the first dynasty pharaoh J at Abydos, where archaeologists uncovered the remains of 318 individuals, men, women, and even children, who had been sacrificed and buried in neat rows outside the king's enclosure. The scale of the carnage is staggering. The largest known case of human sacrifice in ancient Egypt, the victims appear to have been palace servants, members of the royal household who were selected to serve the king in death. As they had in life, they were likely killed by strangulation or a blow to the head, their bodies hastily mummified and buried with minimal grave goods. Some were even interred in coffins bearing their own names, a poignant reminder of their individual identities and the violent fate that awaited them. What could have motivated such a mass slaughter? For the pharaoh and his priests, it was a natural extension of the king's divine power, his ability to command obedience and service even beyond the grave. The servants were seen as privileged to be chosen for this sacred duty, their sacrifice a necessary part of ensuring the pharaoh's eternal well-being. But one can only imagine the terror and despair of those selected, knowing they would soon be joining their master in death. This disturbing practice appears to have been relatively short-lived, dying out by the end of the Old Kingdom, but it speaks to the incredible power and allure of the afterlife in ancient Egyptian culture and the extreme lengths to which some pharaohs would go to secure their place in it. The idea of an eternal existence beyond death, where the pharaoh would reign supreme among the gods, was so intoxicating that it justified even the most horrific acts of violence and sacrifice. And it wasn't just human servants who, as the centuries passed, ancient Egypt's New Kingdom period gave way to the late period, a time of foreign invasions and rule by outside powers. The Libyans, Nubians, Assyrians, and Persians all took their turn at the helm, wresting control of Egypt from native pharaohs, but perhaps no foreign power left quite as indelible a mark as Alexander the Great and the Greek Macedonian Ptolemaic dynasty. He left in his wake in 332 BC. Alexander the Great swept into Egypt, wresting it from Persian control. After being crowned pharaoh in Memphis, he founded the great seaside city of Alexandria, soon to become a cosmopolitan center of Greek culture and learning. But Alexander's reign as pharaoh was cut short by his untimely death in 323 BC. In the chaotic aftermath, his general Ptolemy seized control of Egypt, installing himself as the first pharaoh of the Ptolemaic dynasty that would rule for the next 275 years. The Ptolemaic pharaohs were a fascinating fusion of Greek and Egyptian culture. They adopted many Egyptian royal traditions and religious practices to legitimize their rule in the eyes of their subjects. Ptolemy I's son and successor Ptolemy II Philadelphus even instituted worship of the deified Alexander, cleverly positioning the Ptolemies as successors to Alexander's divine rule. Yet at the same time, the Ptolemies remained resolutely Greek, marrying their siblings in the Egyptian royal tradition, but giving their children Greek names and hiring Greek architects to reshape Alexandria's landscape in the style of their homeland. One of the most audacious Ptolemaic building projects was surely the pharaoh's lighthouse, constructed on the orders of Ptolemy I, standing an astonishing 330 foot tall. This wonder of the ancient world guided ships into Alexandria's harbor with its blazing fire at night. The Ptolemies also built grand temples in the traditional Egyptian style, like the Temple of Horus at Edfu and the Temple of Isis on the island of Phil, but they added their own Greek flourishes, inscribing their names in hieroglyphs, but also Greek on temple walls. The most famous Ptolemaic pharaoh of all was, of course, Cleopatra I, the last pharaoh of ancient Egypt. But the Ptolemaic dynasty's notorious incestuous marriages produced more than one ambitious, powerful queen over the centuries. Take Berenice II, wife of Ptolemy III Euergetes. When her husband left to fight in the Third Syrian War in 246 BC, Bones vowed to the goddess Aphrodite that she would cut off her long, luxurious hair if Ptolemy returned home safely, and she made good on her promise, placing her chantresses in Aphrodite's temple. The hair later mysteriously vanished, but court astronomer Conan of Samos, perhaps trying to get back in the queen's good graces, claimed that Aphrodite had been so touched by the offering that she placed Bren's hair in the sky as the constellation Coma Bones's, or Bones's hair. The Ptolemaic pharaohs were also no strangers to court intrigues and power struggles. One of the most dramatic examples came after the death of Ptolemy IV in 204 BC. His young son Ptolemy V, not even 6 years old, was next in line for the throne, but the boy king's regents Agathocles and Ctesibius weren't about to give up their influence and power. They did the unthinkable, having the young pharaoh's mother Arzino was guarded by the most loyal and fearsome of his warriors, but even with all of these precautions, the life of a pharaoh was a precarious one. The annals of Egyptian history are filled with the stories of pharaohs who met untimely and often gruesome ends, from assassination and warfare to disease and dark sorcery. In the end, the pharaoh was as much a prisoner of his divine role as he was its beneficiary. For all of his power and privilege, he was ultimately a slave to the crushing weight of tradition, superstition, and the unyielding expectations of his gods and his people. The life of a pharaoh was indeed a gilded cage, opulent and glittering on the outside, but constricted